Topical questions, and will now move to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 5407 in the name of John Swinney on the Budget Scotland number 2 bill. I would invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now. And Mr Swinney, if you are ready, would you like to speak to and move the motion, please? Cabinet Secretary, you have 14 minutes, and I would just say at the beginning that we're pretty tight for time today, so people can confine themselves to those speaking times. That would be a great help. Thank you.
Presiding Officer, last week I introduced the Budget Scotland Bill for 2013-14, which will give effect to the draft budget that I set out in September of last year. I thank all of those who have contributed so far to the budget process, including the Finance Committee, whose report I have responded to this week, and to the subject committees for the scrutiny they have given to the Government's spending plans. As in previous years, I am committed to working constructively with all parties to build agreement on the bill's contents and to secure its parliamentary passage. I am willing to consider alternative spending proposals if other parties wish to advance them, and provided that they are accompanied by proposals that identify the sources from where the necessary funding would be drawn. I turn now to the context for the bill and the principles that underpin the Government's proposals. We continue to face acute challenges to public spending in Scotland, with another real terms reduction to our total departmental expenditure limit budget for 2013-14. As Parliament is aware, Scotland continues to face significant challenges as a result of global economic conditions and the United Kingdom Government's approach to the public finances. The settlement that we received in the UK spending review is the toughest since devolution, over a 4-year period between 2010-11 and 2014-15, taking into account the consequentials received in the December autumn statement. The Scottish Government budget has been cut by around 8% in real terms, and within that our capital budget has been reduced by over 25%. This approach by the UK Government to public spending does not effectively support the need to strengthen economic recovery. In June 2010, when the Office for Budget Responsibility set out its initial forecast for the UK economy, it predicted growth of 2.8% in 2012. Members can contrast that with the International Monetary Fund's recent forecast for a contraction of 0.4% in 2012 and the latest OECD forecast for a decline of 0.1%, which is what the OBR is now forecasting itself for this year. Despite the UK economy growing by 0.9% in Q3, the economy is still the same size that it was in the third quarter of 2011, and output is forecast to fall again in Q4. This continued stagnation reinforces the case that the Scottish Government continues to make, which is that a different strategy is required from the UK Government and underpins the principles applied to this bill. The bill addresses a number of key challenges. The first is the need to accelerate economic recovery by creating jobs and supporting people into employment, particularly our young people, and by supporting Scottish business, including by capitalising on new opportunities in the low-carbon economy. Secondly, the bill addresses the need to maintain infrastructure investment as a key part of our economic strategy and in the face of the severe cuts to our capital DEL settlement. Thirdly, it takes forward an ambitious programme of public sector reform, together with our delivery partners, to ensure the sustainability and quality of our services and to make a decisive shift in favour of preventative expenditure. Finally, the bill delivers on our commitment to a social wage at a time of intense pressure on household budgets. Those challenges are brought into sharp focus by the continuing uncertainty in the global economic outlook. The Government's spending decisions will continue to be guided by our purpose of increasing sustainable economic growth and by working to deliver our programme for government and the economic strategy. Global economic conditions continue to impact on economic confidence. Business investment remains considerably below pre-recession levels, whilst household incomes remain under pressure. We are therefore focused on enhancing confidence in order to encourage private sector investment and growth, and to help households where we can. To address then each of the challenges within the budget, the Government has set out in the 2013-14 draft budget a series of commitments that it has made to the people of Scotland, and that within tight parameters introduce additional measures to support economic recovery beyond those that were set out in the spending review. It includes investment in infrastructure, the green economy, skills and employability of around £250 million, in addition to the decisive measures already funded in the spending review. These include our Opportunities for All initiative, which offers all 16 to 19-year-olds not already in work, education or training, a learning or training place, which would be supported by the Opportunities for All programme. We have removed the barrier to higher education created by tuition fees. We are maintaining student numbers at our colleges, and we are delivering a record level of modern apprenticeships. The budget bill builds on these and many others. Of course.
James Kelly.
Just on his point about maintaining numbers at colleges, does he accept that there are 80,000 less college places this year?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, what I accept is that the government has done two things. We have maintained student numbers at colleges at the level that we said we would maintain them at 2011-12 levels. And we have also ensured that the training and education opportunities available at our colleges are aligned to enable young people to enter the labour market. And that is a key aspect of the reform programme, to ensure that young people are given the best opportunity possible to enter the labour market as a result of their college experience. The budget bill builds on these and many other steps the government is taking by funding the government's new employer recruitment initiative, which will support employment creation amongst SMEs, and the establishment of the Energy Skills Academy, which will help us to maximise the employment opportunities available in the energy sector. The spending review has made provision for the delivery of the most generous package of business rates relief in any part of the United Kingdom. Yesterday, the Minister for Local Government and Planning announced that from the 1st of April, an additional business rates relief of up to 100% would be available on new build empty properties for up to 18 months to encourage speculative development and investment. The Government will continue to work to deliver interventions that support business in Scotland. I'll give way to Mr Rennie.
The Minister for giving way. The Finance Secretary showed the Finance Committee that his mid-year estimate for business rates was around about £90 million higher than what he had budgeted. Can you give the Parliament an update on that figure?
I have no additional information to share with Parliament on that question. I remain confident that the assessments that I have made of non-domestic rates and applied into the budget bill are sustainable given the current performance on non-domestic rates and involve a prudent set of assumptions about the degree of appeal losses that are likely as a consequence of a significant number of appeals still remaining to be resolved as a consequence of the revaluation undertaken and applied in 2010. The second major theme of the bill, Presiding Officer, is support for capital investment, which the Scottish Government believes is crucial for economic recovery. The Office for Budget Responsibility estimate that current spending has a fiscal multiplier of 0.6, whilst capital spending has a multiplier of 1. This means that capital spending will provide a greater short-term boost to the economy. Based on the OBR multipliers, £250 million in current spending increases GDP by £150 million, whilst a corresponding increase in capital spending increases GDP by £250 million. Capital investment is therefore central to our plans. We are supporting our capital programme by taking forward the £2.5 billion non-profit distributing pipeline of infrastructure projects, by using innovative funding mechanisms to lever in additional resources, and by switching over £700 million from resource budgets to support capital investment over the spending review period. I'll give way to Mr Brown.
Grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. In relation to the transfer from resource to capital, the fact that Scottish Enterprise will now transfer £99 million instead of £200 million, is that bad news for the economy based on the figures he's just given us?
Well, what I would say to Mr Brown is that I set out to Parliament that in 2012-13 we would be transferring approximately £200 million from resource to capital. In 2013-14, £240 million in total from resource to capital. Those are the plans that the Government will deliver, so there is no change to the total level of resource to capital transfer that the Government will bring forward to support economic growth and economic recovery at this time. I'll give way to Mr McIntosh.
Ken McIntosh.
To explain why his own NPD programme through the Scottish Futures Trust has been cut by more than £300 million in successive years.
Cabinet Secretary.
That's just complete nonsense. I've just said to Parliament that £2.5 billion non-profit distributing pipeline of infrastructure investment. So it would be nice if Mr Macintosh would actually listen to what is said, rather than reading out some pre-prepared nonsense which is factually incorrect into the bargain. The budget bill gives effect to the announcement the government made in December about the allocation of around £165 million of additional capital funding to a range of shovel-ready projects. One of our highest priorities is action on housing, which is why the government allocated a further £50 million to the housing budget in December 2012. This is the fourth tranche of additional funding for housing since the spending review in 2011. The government has therefore allocated nearly £200 million of extra funding to housing in decisions taken during 2012, demonstrating that where it has an opportunity to invest, the government does exactly that. The investment will not only, if Mr Brown will forgive me, I need to cover some more ground. The investment will not only increase the supply of social and affordable housing, but will support our construction sector, help to create jobs and stimulate economic growth. Public service reform is at the heart of the government's approach to the public finances, and the economy is the third theme of the economy, and the reform programme is the third theme of the government's budget bill. Our programme of reform is helping to ensure that public resources are used to best effect in meeting the needs of the people of Scotland. We have made it clear that a decisive shift to preventative spending is essential, and the focus given to this aspect of the budget bill by committees indicates the significance attached to this approach to policy by everyone within the Parliament. In partnership with local government, we have made more than £500 million available to three change funds to support early years in adult social care and to tackle re-offending. We look forward to taking prevention beyond the change funds. To this end, single outcome agreements will from this year incorporate a long-term prevention plan that makes a commitment to increase the resource invested and reinvested over time in preventative interventions. Alongside our investment in the economy and public services, the government also recognises the need to support households, businesses and individuals, which is the fourth element of the budget bill. Coupled to the measures that we are taking to protect the National Health Service budget, to freeze the council tax and to pay a Scottish living wage, we have tried to establish in our budget a balance between the necessity of protecting household incomes and delivering the focus on the economy that lies at the heart of the government's actions in every respect. Over the past 3 years, our policy of pay restraint has helped to support thousands of public sector jobs, while the living wage and our pay awards have protected the incomes of those who earn the least. Our commitment to fairness is also central to the government's response to the United Kingdom's government's programme of welfare reform. We are addressing some of the impacts of those reforms in a number of interventions that we are making along with our local government partners, including funding of around £50 million to increase the Scottish Welfare Fund and plug the funding gap the UK Government has created through its handling of the abolition of council tax benefit. I confirm to Parliament that this bill gives effect to the transfer to Scottish local government of £328 million from the UK Government as a result of the arrangements that surround the changes to council tax benefit. The transfer relates to the devolution of responsibility in this area to Scotland and does not increase the discretionary spending power we have in 2013-14. I also confirm to Parliament that we will take forward the Deputy First Minister's announcement this week of further funding to help those facing the effects of UK benefit cuts. The Scottish Government has committed additional funding of over £5 million over 2 years to our frontline advisory services and other measures of support. Spending in 2013-14 will be reflected in an in-year budget revision. The budget bill before Parliament therefore includes the core budget allocated to Scotland by the UK Government, the transfer of £328 million in relation to the abolition of council tax benefit, the additional capital spending that was set out in the December announcement, and makes use of the budget exchange mechanism which is available to the Scottish Government. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, I believe that this budget provides a bold and ambitious programme of investment in our people and our infrastructure in the context of the most challenging financial environment that Scotland has faced since devolution. The Government has taken decisions to prioritise employability and economic recovery, to build for the future and to ensure that our public services are supported in the years to come. That is the foundation of the Government's budget. I look forward to the debate on these issues as part of the budget process. I will give consideration to any constructive and positive suggestions that are made, and I commend a budget that I believe meets the needs of the people of Scotland to Parliament today.
Many thanks. I now call on Ken McIntosh. 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And it seems that each time I speak in a debate with Mr Swinney, I begin by acknowledging that on the face of it, at least, there is more that unites us than divides us. In this case, we acknowledge that the Cabinet Secretary has had to deal with a difficult financial settlement from the coalition government and an unwelcome backdrop of international economic uncertainty. Unfortunately, however, much as we are united in disagreeing with the wrong-headed austerity economics approach of George Osborne, we are divided on Mr Swinney's mistaken assumption that there is nothing he can do. We are divided on the notion that this Parliament cannot make a difference. And fundamentally, Presiding Officer, we are divided on the SNP's claim that this is a budget for jobs and growth, when all the evidence points to the contrary. In fact, if I may remind members, 12 months ago, the previous budget, the Cabinet Secretary pledged that his budget would, quote, accelerate economic recovery, support economic growth and improve public services in Scotland. But what did it really achieve? A £66 million cut from the housing budget, further crippling the Scottish construction industry, a £52.5 million cut from the college's budget, leading to fewer places for tens of thousands of students. And the overall impact of this so-called budget for jobs, 30,000 public sector jobs gone, 1 in 4 young people out of work, and long-term unemployment rising faster in Scotland than in any other part of the United Kingdom. In the face of this evidence as to his handiwork, Presiding Officer, this year offered the Cabinet Secretary at least the opportunity to revisit his thinking. But no, sure enough, Mr Swinney again promised us a budget for jobs and growth, when he is doing little more than tinker around the edges of George Osborne's austerity plan. It is a convenient soundbite, nothing more. Even in this Parliament, where there is an inbuilt government-supporting majority on every committee, the Finance Committee refused to endorse the suggestion this was a budget for jobs and growth. And yet, Presiding Officer, that is exactly what we need. 2 weeks ago, this Parliament united in recognising the scale of the problem of youth unemployment in this country and the scarring effect it has on young people. Just this weekend, I had another constituent come to one of my surgeries with a familiar story of frustration bordering on despair at his inability to secure a job. What frustrated me was his experience of a system which left him feeling even more vulnerable, and indeed that he was somehow to blame, alongside his practical difficulty in accessing college training or reskilling courses that would boost his confidence and employability. The Cabinet Secretary has pledged again and again that unemployment is this government's priority, but it is not just that the Cabinet Secretary has failed to make a difference, it is that his actions simply do not match his words. Last year, the Cabinet Secretary was forced into an 11th-hour U-turn on cuts to college funding. But despite that, the college budget was still slashed by £52 million, with the result that there are 70,000 fewer people at college this year than there were 3 years ago. And quite frankly, Presiding Officer, that's a staggering indictment of SNP policy. As the Cabinet Secretary so often reminds us, government is about choices. This year, the SNP's choice is to hammer colleges yet again. And let's be in no doubt, this choice has not been forced upon them by Westminster. This is a decision made in Scotland. The result will be the denial of further education for thousands more Scots of all ages and yet longer college waiting lists. We believe that the £35 million needed to reverse the cuts to further education can be found from a combination of forecast underspend, efficiencies and savings, such as on the 16 referendum work streams, or profligate government vanity projects like the Ryder Cup junket or the Scotland House fiasco during the Olympic Games. If this was truly a budget for jobs and growth, the government would be investing in colleges and investing in our young people's future. Scottish Labour believes in investing in these young lives, and we call on the government, even at this late stage, to reverse its cuts to colleges and to support our beleaguered further education sector.
Bruce Crawford.
Sorry, Mr Crawford. Oh, no intervention from Mr Crawford. Mr Crawford is clearly happier making interventions from a sedentary position, but when challenged, finds, oh, Mr Crawford, thank you.
Bruce Crawford.
The member read out some areas where Labour would make some cuts, but in her Cuts Commission speech, John Lamont said there's a great reward for taking hard decisions. Which of the decisions you just put forward are hard decisions? Because it's all just a flim-flam of nonsense you've just put forward.
Ken Macintosh.
I actually identified areas where the Scottish people would be delighted to see the Scottish Government make cuts, including on these trips to the Ryder Cup and Scotland House in London. Presiding Officer, many of us will have joined Shelter just before the Christmas recess when they asked us to support their campaign to find a home for the 5,500 children who are without such a basic essential of life. Housing need is reaching crisis levels, with almost 200,000 households on council housing lists across the country and almost 335,000 on housing association lists. On top of this, 62% of Scotland's social housing currently falls beneath the new Scottish Housing Quality Standard. This qualifies as a serious problem now, and one that this government has the powers to fix now. Following the UK Government's autumn statement, Mr Swinney was given capital consequentials of £331 million over 2 years. Labour believes that this money should be allocated in its entirety to Scottish house building. Not only would this address a pressing social need, such a sum would help get the construction industry working again. With sensible procurement policies, it would help provide jobs and apprenticeships, as well as boost Scotland's small businesses. We believe it could help fund an expanded retrofit programme, mid-range as well as affordable housing. This was the evidence given to the Infrastructure and Finance Committees by Shelter and the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations, by the Scottish Building Federation and the Construction Union UCAT. It was a convincing and persuasive argument, which is not only why we in the Labour Party support it, but why the Finance Committee came to a similar conclusion.
John Swinney.
Mr Swinney.
Grateful to Mr Macintosh, and I just would like him to give us a little bit more detail on his proposal to allocate the £331 million capital consequentials all to housing. Will he confirm to Parliament that will mean taking allocated money away from the higher and further education sector, away from local government in Scotland, and away from essential improvements in other areas of infrastructure in our country?
Ken Macintosh.
It means nothing of the sort. And if the Cabinet Secretary would listen, not only does the Cabinet Secretary may be in denial about the cuts he's made to his own NPT programme.
Order.
Just to be quite clear, these spending priorities, which are the ones outlined for other members, Mr Swinney has outlined the commitments he made in December to additional spending using the autumn consequentials. I am suggesting that the Scottish Government's own Scottish Futures NPT programme, which is there and has the capacity clearly to fund such capital programmes, should be used for that purpose. It had the capacity because a matter of a few months ago, it was cut by £300 million. Now I am suggesting that he use it for the purpose. Can I suggest, Presiding Officer, the Cabinet Secretary rather proudly talks about the way he's revisited the housing budget 4 times this year. Presiding Officer, trying to correct yourself 4 times in 1 year, in most people's book, is a frank admission of failure. But despite those corrections, rather than Mr Swinney's grandiose and overblown claim to be kick-starting a housing boom, the net result is still that the SNP are still choosing to cut £42 million in real terms from the housing budget. The whole partial restoration of his cuts confirms the impression of a half-hearted attempt at stimulating the economy. Now, turning to transport and infrastructure, this government often seems to be unembarrassable about the gap between their election manifesto promises and their record in office. But one of the most shameless broken promises in this session has been the slashing of the Edinburgh-Glasgow rail improvement budget by at least a third. This is the sort of infrastructure project that those of us who purportedly believe in a more Keynesian economic approach were united around, and I thought John Swinney counted himself in that number, but it would appear not. The Egypt investment would not just deliver jobs or help commuters. Providing good public transport is yet another way for a government to support people back into the job market. And all we in the Scottish Labour Party are asking for is the SNP to deliver on their own election promise for Network Rail to fund this investment from their rail asset base. Presiding Officer, I have set out 3 areas which are fair, affordable and which would make a genuine difference in stimulating the economy and improving the employment prospects of people across the country. I have not had time to do justice to all the areas where the Cabinet Secretary can make a real difference, on childcare, on procurement, or on a properly funded flagship wage subsidy programme. And frankly, Presiding Officer, I am absolutely astonished we have yet to see the detail on this issue that the Cabinet Secretary promised in his statement back in September. My colleague Helen Eadie, building on the work of the European Committee, has identified hundreds of millions of pounds in untapped support that is potentially available through the European Union. I have hardly touched on the fact that this budget does nothing for our hard-pressed high streets. Shop after shop is closing, and yet the Government insists on providing millions of pounds in support to tax-avoiding companies like Amazon, and proposes a hike in this budget in business rates of an eye-watering £172 million in
you must
cash
draw to a
terms.
close, please.
If Mr Swinney's only crime was to be found guilty of making exaggerated claims, our reaction might be simply one of disapproval. But it is the failure to use the powers at his disposal and to follow through on his own economic analysis that is the most serious charge. He has the opportunity to revisit this budget. I would urge him to take that chance.
Many thanks. I now call on Gavin Brown. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Let me begin in the spirit of consensus by agreeing with something that the Cabinet Secretary said in his opening speech, because when he was intervened upon by Ken Macintosh, who talked about £300 million being cut from NPD spend, Mr Swinney said that Mr Macintosh was talking utter nonsense. Right. That is absolutely correct. There is not £300 million being cut. It's far closer thus far to £500 million being cut. So Mr Macintosh really ought to look at the figures more carefully before throwing accusations at the Scottish Government. And that's not taking into account next year, of course. That was purely for 11-12 and 12-13. Deputy Presiding Officer, this is a Scottish Government under pressure when it has come to this year's budget. On the day that the budget was launched, there was almost nobody who accepted the Scottish Government's argument that it was a budget for the economy. And since the 20th of September, when it was launched, we have still yet to find many, or indeed any, who agree that it is a budget for the economy, including the Finance Committee, which was alluded to, who failed to support a proposition that this was a budget that genuinely prioritised the economy. Sure, happy to give way.
John
for giving way, but would you also accept that while lots of people have suggested how we could spend extra money, not many people have suggested how we could spend the present money better?
Gavin Brown.
Well, Mr Mason, if you look at Conservative proposals at the last election, and since we have suggested the mutualisation of Scottish Water, which would save at least £100 million a year in capital, we have proposed making concessionary travel age 65, which we believe would save £35 million a year. We have made suggestions about a graduate contribution and about free prescription. So it is not true at all to say that the Scottish Conservatives haven't put forward proposals. And I think my memory serves me correct that in a previous debate, Mr Mason, on the record, even said at least the Conservatives have put forward some suggestions. He didn't agree with them, but he acknowledges, he's nodding that he has said in the past that we have indeed put forward proposals. Deputy Presiding Officer, we have some particular concerns, though, about some areas where the economy is not being prioritised. And one of them, clearly, is colleges. We've all seen the very depressing youth unemployment figures in Scotland and indeed across the rest of the United Kingdom, but still we see a drastic reduction to the college's budget next year. It's £546 million, according to the Government, in the current year, and it will be £511.7 million, according to the Scottish Government, next year. A drop of £34 million in cash terms in a single year. A 6% cut in cash terms at a time when the Scottish budget as a whole, much to the Cabinet Secretary's disappointment, sees an increase. A cash terms increase to the Scottish budget as a whole of £7 million. A very small increase, I have to say, but a cash increase nonetheless. We have particular concerns, Deputy Presiding Officer, about this Government's approach to taxation. They started well back in 2007-8. when they introduced the small business bonus, an excellent suggestion which has helped businesses all across the country. But since they were re-elected, we've seen the retail levy being brought in, we've seen the empty property rates tax being brought in, one which punishes the unlucky and those who are unable to let or sell on their properties, and we see an over-reliance on business rates, a 7% increase in the amount that they believe they will collect next year, and a 9% increase in the amount they believe they will collect the year after. Yet at the same time, when questions are raised about those particular figures, there is a point-blank refusal of this government to share those figures with Parliament. Despite the Finance Committee last year and this year asking for more regular updates of the collection rates of non-domestic rates, we get nothing except the annual projection, and after the event, the annual actual collection rates. And we know, as a matter of fact, there have been years where they haven't collected as much as they projected to collect. That's why it's important that we as a Parliament have these figures. We have concerns also, Deputy Presiding Officer, about housing. We hear about these 4 additional tranches that have been put back in, and they keep emphasising the word additional money. But actually what it does do is it simply decreases the shortfall. It's not an actual increase in housing at all. Over the period of the 3-year period, if they'd kept at flat cash rates from 11-12, there would have been £800 million going into housing, but now it's going to be £650 million. So it's better than the £450 million that was projected, but it's still 650 instead of 800. So to suggest that is additional gives me a very interesting interpretation of the word additional. Now, there's not time in my speech now, but I'll return to it in closing in relation to capital projects, and particularly the NPD model, which this government, I think, has really let the country down on. We have been absolutely over-promised on that and under-delivered, and I think it's about time the government took accountability for that and gave us some explanation. Thank you.
Many thanks. And we now move to open debate. Speakers of 6 minutes. Call on Kenny Gibson, to be followed by James Kelly. Mr Gibson, up to 6 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, I'm no Mystic Meg. However, following the entirely predictable tone of Ken Macintosh and Gavin Brown, I don't think I need a crystal ball to tell me that they will vote against this budget at stage 3 and do exactly the same in 2014, 15 and 16. The opposition should be honest and tell the Chamber that there is nothing the Cabinet Secretary can say or do to persuade them to support Scottish Government budgets for the rest of this Parliament. However, others are more positive, contrary to what Mr Brown has just said. On 20 September last year, Graham Smith, STUC General Secretary, said of the SNP Government's budget, and I quote, "The UK Coalition Government's dangerously irresponsible economic strategy has placed the Scottish Government in a very difficult position, and Mr Swinney has endeavoured throughout the crisis to do what he can to stimulate the Scottish economy." While today, Liz Cameron, Chief Executive of the Scottish Chambers of Commerce, said, "We particularly welcome the continued focus that the Government places on the maximisation of capital spending and infrastructure investment. We believe that this will achieve both short-term advantage in terms of delivering a boost to the construction sector and also benefit the Scottish economy in the longer term." Of course, in due course, Labour's nomenclature are still seething at losing what they see as their God-given sense of entitlement, the right to lord it over Scotland indefinitely, and bitterly resent those pesky nationalists, not just for shaking them out of their complacency by defeating them narrowly in 2007, but for the humiliating disaster Labour suffered in 2011. Labour are Scotland's political chameleons, and their U-turns on their U-turns, whether in relation to tuition fees, the council tax freeze or small business bonus scheme, are well known. However, Ken Macintosh seems unaware even of his own declared position. On 20th of December, I asked him whether he would retract his statement that switching £250 million from resource to capital would cost 8,333 jobs, a very precise figure, obviously worked out lazily on the back of an envelope at £30,000 a job. I was somewhat taken aback by Mr Macintosh's response that I have no idea what Mr Gibson's remark refers to. He seemed unaware of his own press release of 12th of October 2012, in which he said that switching resource to capital would suck further demand out of the Scottish economy. Maybe Mr Macintosh should ask Labour's press office to at least do him the courtesy of running the releases that go out in his name past him before sending them out. So what is Labour's position on switching resource to capital, Mr Macintosh? On cue.
Ken McIntosh.
Glad Mr Gibson hangs on my every word. Can I ask Mr Gibson, because he said that there would be no chance of Labour supporting the SNP this year or any other year, can I ask Mr Gibson if he believes the Scottish Government should meet our demands on housing, on rail and on colleges, and if so, does he accept my assurance that we would support them?
Mr Gibson.
To be met. They're designed for public consumption. You're actually deceiving the people of Scotland to say that everything you demand can be met. And this nonsense today, this plucking this out of thin air, whereby you want to actually deny £22 million each for transport and regeneration projects, £19 million for higher education, £11 million for economic development projects, £10 million for health maintenance, etc., by putting them into NPD, which you should know has at least an 18 months procurement schedule, whereas 93% of the money Mr Swinney announced will be spent actually within 15 months. Of course, in the same debate, Gavin Brown tried desperately to talk up the struggling UK government. He asked my colleague Mike Mackenzie how many countries in the world can borrow more cheaply than the UK. Well, Mr Brown, how about Denmark, Germany, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden and Switzerland, to name a few European countries, or further afield Hong Kong, Japan and Singapore? Sadly, the number will grow after today's revelation that the UK borrowed an astronomical £15.4 billion during December 2012. And today we have crocodile tears from Mr Brown, who moaned about the £30 million health levy. No surprise for a party that opposed the smoking ban, yet stays silent about £1 billion additional VAT burden, £2.5 billion cost to Scotland of the Welfare Reform Act, 81p a litre tax on fuel, the annual tax grab on public sector pensions, and insults our intelligence by pretending that an infinitesimal cash increase in the Scottish budget somehow shows the generosity of a UK government that slashed this parliament's resource and capital projects. And as for the Scottish Futures Trust, the Tories' stopgap leader, Ruth Davidson, not only misquoted me at FMQs last Thursday, although unlike some sensitive souls in the opposition benches, I'm not going to whine through a fake point of order about it, but it was £147 million out in our figures. You'll have to get her to do her homework better than that, Gavin. The reality is that the SFT represents additionality, will deliver key projects that otherwise wouldn't happen in less time than the Tory Labour PFI monstrosity and at much less cost to the public purse. The Tories' dog-like devotion to their inept London bosses has left them effectively marginalised in Scotland. Perhaps a willingness to stand up for Scotland might change that, but pigs will fly first. Mr Brown.
Gavin Brown, briefly.
What an awful thing to say that Mr Gibson may have been misquoted, but let him correct the record then. Is he impressed by the rate of progress of the NPD pipeline?
Kenny Gibson.
Mr Brown, is that he particularly went out of his way to avoid the fact that some £300 million has actually been switched from the NPD programme to the regulatory asset base for the Borders Railway. So I think you're not actually being quite accurate in terms of what you've been saying on this. Of course, while opposition parties criticise the budget bill and speak more spending on spending colleges, housing, etc., until today, we haven't been told where the funding would actually come from. When I asked Malcolm Chisholm, for example, in the last debate, he said people will make different choices. But until today, we heard nothing. All we've heard is some kind of airy-fairy idea from Mr Macintosh about actually cancelling projects which are going to happen now in order to have others in the future. This is actually basically just about moving the goalposts for Mr Macintosh and the Labour Party.
Please.
This budget bill has jobs and economic growth at its heart, and where the Scottish Government can to act and promote growth time again, and it has, in investing in construction skills, housing, the green economy, schools for the future. And it's at that contrast to Wales, where Labour remain in power and have cut the NHS by a whopping 8%, we predicted health spending. This bill supports low-paid workers through tough times, small businesses, bonuses, and boost capital investment.
Mr Gibson, you are closing now. Thank you. I call on James Kelly to be followed by Stuart Stevenson. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I welcome the opportunity to take part in this afternoon's debate. In examining the Scottish budget, it comes against a backdrop of 1 in 5 Scottish youngsters out of work. We see Homes for Scotland telling us that fewer homes have been built now than since 1926, and there are 80,000 less college places, with waiting lists continuing to grow. Against that background, the SNP needed to produce a budget which meets these needs, but have failed to meet the challenge. The response in this budget, as Mr Macintosh pointed out, is to introduce college cuts of £34.6 million. And in terms of the choices that have been made, local government have been penalised. 83% of the cuts which have been passed on from the UK government have been passed directly to local government. And this will undermine growth, local economic growth in local areas. And it will also make the challenge of local government as they face up to the prospect of the Welfare Reform Act very difficult indeed. Local communities really are being hammered by this. I give way to Mr Swinney.
I'm grateful to Mr Kelly for giving way. Mr Kelly just made a point about the pressure on local government finance. I've used these statistics before to Mr Kelly, so I think he might have thought about that point before he made it again. But between 2007-8 and 2012-13, the Scottish Government's budget increased by 6.4%. Over the same period, local government's budget increased by 8.9%. How does Mr Kelly evidence the rubbish he has just put on the official record?
Quite simply, Mr Swinney, we're talking about a cut of 4.3% in real terms to local government. What that means is that local councils are having to make very difficult choices across the country. What that means, just hold on, what that means is that we're seeing care packages being cut and very difficult decisions being made, cuts across the country as a direct result of your budget, Mr Swinney. I give way to the member for running down Glasgow.
James
Well, whilst in the process of running down Glasgow, as you say, would you agree then that if the councils have such financial restraints, that maybe a better way of using that very precious money that they get would be to use it on services as opposed to huge payouts to Labour Party cronies?
James Kelly.
If councils across the country had fair settlements from this SNP government, then they would be able to support economic growth and to protect communities in their area. The direct result of the decisions that have been taken by this government is that local councils are being penalised and having to take the brunt of these difficulties. Moving on to some of the issues that have got to be addressed here. In terms of what could make a real difference and a real boost, the government should look again at the decision to cut £350 million from the Edinburgh to Glasgow Improvement Project. This rail project, we're told time and time again by business, would make a real difference in terms of connectivity. We would be able to see improvements in journey times, and that would strengthen economic growth as well as improving the links between Edinburgh and Glasgow. You could also see investments in rolling stock, which would create jobs for the steel industry in Scotland, and maybe we would see some of the investment come to Scotland this time, unlike the Forth Road Bridge, where 68% of the allocated money has gone out of this country rather than supporting Scottish steelworkers. But why should we be... I'm sorry, I'm running out of time. But why should we be surprised? As others have said, this also resonates with the slow progress of the government in terms of supporting capital investment. On their own published documents on the budget for this year and next year on NPD projects, £681 million less has been spent than committed. The government, who are continuing to call for more powers and telling us how everything would be a land of milk and honey under independence, they can't even use the levers that they've got effectively. They should start to use that before demanding more powers. In terms of the great demand for the SNP as to where the money would be found, there's a number of areas. One area I'd certainly like to see is a review of IT projects recommended by the McClelland Commission. Audit Scotland last year identified £133 million in IT projects that had to be cancelled. So that should be looked at closely. And I think we should also examine the amount of money spent on spin doctors, £2.6 million in the NHS alone. I'd rather have classroom assistants in Cambuslang than spin doctors in St Andrew's House.
Come to a close, please.
And summing up, Deputy Presiding Officer, people in our communities are crying out for investment in jobs. The SNP have failed to deliver. They need to address these shortcomings, invest in housing, colleges and rail, drive up growth and create jobs throughout all of Scotland.
Thank you. Stuart Stevenson, to be followed by Michael McMahon.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I hope to provide a measured contribution. I think James Kelly, Presiding Officer, may have been slightly unwise in going into IT projects. I merely direct him at Labour's NHS England project, £12 billion abandoned. We can do a great deal better in Scotland, and we always do. Now, what I did do in preparing for this debate was, of course, to scrutinise the motion that's before the House, and it's more startling for its omission rather than commission. Omission, that is, of any amendment to the motion before us. So we can expect the Labour Party, most vocal in demand, least visible in identifying action, to vote for, of necessity, to the unamended motion before us, thus endorsing all within it. Or, should we see an abstention or outright opposition, thus seeking to disrupt funding for health, for transport, for education, for local government, because I am a little more optimistic than my colleague Kenny Gibson. Although Mystic Meg probably has a more sensible idea of what is going to happen. I'm encouraged by Ken Gibson's opening remarks. He said more unites us than divides us. So I'm going to lay my money on the idea that they will ultimately decide that the Finance Secretary has brought forward a motion, a budget, which is worthy of support. The whole issue I raise is a matter of parliamentary process and rules. Credibility sought through debate absolutely falls to naught if it's not pursued by every means available. Government budgets are never, I'm sure, produced without vigorous internal debate, keen external scrutiny, and, where required, counter-proposals tabled, debated and decided. Somewhat missing from this debate, except in certain respects, so far. And don't imagine that finance ministers get their own way all the time. We previously saw Parliament reject and then accept our finance minister's proposals. Internally, I'm going to quote from Cabinet minutes to show it can be no easier there on occasion. The Finance Secretary's alarm can be put to one side because the example I quote from, which saw the Finance Minister have to ask, and I quote, that his dissent be recorded to the decision in Cabinet. My example does, however, come from the 8th of May 1919, and the Chancellor was Austen Chamberlain. I'm delighted that the successful proposition, which was on RAF officer pay, came from my father's cousin, James Stevenson, who was attending Cabinet. I can assure those who have not seen me at Cabinet that I, of course, was always impeccably behaved and supported the Finance Secretary because he is always supportable. The occasional glimpse of Labour's agenda can be seen with those with infrared eyes, those who peer into the murky undergrowth. Ken Macintosh has talked about using underspend. Well, of course, the Labour Party has in government a very long history of building up huge underspends, an issue which the SNP government had to confront in the first session. Secondly, savings. Ken Macintosh, in particular, has said savings can be a help here. Well, of course, we're moving from a position of measuring the input to what we do to looking at the value we deliver. And I cite one example which is drawn from transport, of where the partnership between Transport Scotland and Network Rail has actually delivered exactly in the way that is desired on this government's watch. And that's the Paisley Canal project, where the original budget was £28 million. That project was actually delivered on time for £12 million. And that's the approach that this government will take. Not so much cutting the output as looking at getting effective use of the input. Yes, I shall.
Ken McIntosh.
Can I ask Mr Stevenson how, by cutting the e-group programme, he has delivered on his promises to the commuters of Stirling, Dunblane and Alloa?
Stuart Stevenson, you're approaching your last minute.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The member knows perfectly well that we have an investment programme for the railways in Scotland, which is far in excess of anything south of the border. Indeed, Rail Monthly magazine carried a cartoon in the not-too-distant past which said ScotRail England, because they want our policies south of the border. Now, of course, Labour also focus on education, but they take no responsibility for the £332 million which appears in the budget to cover PPP projects, which essentially were done on their watch. History can speak louder than words, and for Labour it certainly does. On the Cuts Commission, kill the bus pass, lose bus routes. That costs. Charge the oath for prescriptions, increase mortality. That might save in some ways, but I don't think we'd want to unload debt onto students. And of course, for the UK government, today's lending figures, which represent some £87 billion a year in Scottish terms, much more than our budget, are deeply depressing.
Could you conclude, please?
Finally, Presiding Officer, are in a position where we promise it and we deliver it. The SNP does.
Thank you. Michael McMahon, to be followed by Mike Mackenzie.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. When considering this budget, I've been continually reminded of the quote from Stuart Chase, the American Keynesian economist, who said, "For those who believe, no proof is necessary. For those who do not believe, no proof is possible." Experience has taught me to be an unbeliever about the assertions of this government. So, as a non-believer in the government's cause, I am prepared to be dismissed as such by those on the government benches and be accused of taking the view that no proof is possible for their contention that this is a budget for jobs and growth. Fortunately for Mr Swinney, no proof is necessary for his backbenchers. He has said this is a budget for growth, therefore it must be true, and Mr Stevenson and Mr Gibson have exemplified that view in their contribution. Now, I'm sure... Yes, sir.
Kenneth Gibson.
Sorry? What about the view of the STUC that said that Mr Swinney is doing his best given the financial predicament he's been put in by the UK government?
Well, Mr Gibson, doing your best is not necessarily agreeing. Saying that you're doing your best is not necessarily saying that you're achieving. But I'm sure that the Cabinet Secretary will tell me that I wasn't looking hard enough at the evidence. I'm sure that's the point that Mr Gibson tried to make. But I can assure you that I was. And I'm still prepared to allow the Government to present evidence which sustains their argument that this budget will, in fact, take Scotland's economy forward. Now, while you can do nothing other than accept that this is a tough economic climate in which to bring forward any budget, it's all the more imperative in these circumstances that you obtain that widespread verification that this is a budget which will stimulate the economy before defending it as such. To do this assessment, we rely very much on our committee system to facilitate the fullest scrutiny possible. And unfortunately, rather than our committees looking in depth at what has been put forward and bringing forward evidence based on arguments for the changes to the budget, that we got some committees, such as local government, selecting partial scrutiny, and others, like my own Welfare Reform Committee, forgoing the opportunity to look at the budget at all. I'm going to try and make some progress, Mr Stevenson, but I'll come back to you if I can. So one honourable exception was the Equal Opportunities Committee, without whom there would have been no mention of the horrendous impact of the condemned welfare reforms in the Finance Committee's budget report. So in a time of austerity, when we more than ever need proper analysis, we got compliance with the government's assertion. What we are left with is a Scottish Government proclaiming that its spending priorities will create a more successful country, with opportunities for all of Scotland to flourish through increasing sustainable economic growth, but simply ignores those such as the Scottish Council for Development and Industry, who take the view that it's difficult to discern a pattern of spending which aligns with successive Scottish Government's top priority of increasing sustainable economic growth. SCDI in particular, but not exclusively, questions the decision to prioritise the protection of some areas of public spending at the expense of others, which are directly and indirectly responsible for increases in sustainable economic growth. The Centre for Public Policy for Regions was also sceptical and wonders why the Scottish Government spending priorities fail to show that it helps secure faster economic growth. the Royal Society of Edinburgh states, it would be useful to see a cost-benefit analysis of the Scottish Government's spending decisions against its stated core objective of sustainable economic growth. But never mind, no evidence is needed for the SNP Stepford gang on the backbenches. John Swinney says it so, therefore there is no need to prove that this budget will achieve the aim set for it. So rather than listen to the SCVO...
John Mason.
I thank the member very much for giving way, and he may remember as well that at the Finance Committee there was a suggestion from at least one party that if we cut back on health we could put more into economic growth. Does he think that health should be cut back to boost economic growth?
Michael McMahon.
Well, my recollection is that a lot of organisations suggested that, and one that I'm just going to come on to is SCVO. It is something we have to discuss, Mr Mason. I know that the clacks and horns will sound as soon as you mention that kind of stuff, but you cannot, and this is where spending decisions are important, you cannot just say that you will spend it on one thing and it will achieve sustainable economic growth if what you're spending it on is not aimed at sustainable economic growth. And that was the point that was being made by all of those organisations, one of which was SCVO, who argued that we need to take a long-term, holistic approach to the economy, which encompasses a range of social, environmental and economic outcomes that we get when we have always had from this government short-term populist spending priorities. We are told that this is a budget with the needs of the economy at its core, but what we have is one where only an extra £9 million is specifically spent on enterprise. Now, that's not the type of spending priority we'd expect to see in a budget for growth. Another of the government's assertions is that capital investment continues to be a central element of its approach to supporting economic recovery. Now, there is widespread support for this, but where is the evidence that it will be delivered? The Civil Engineering Contractors Association state that if what is in the budget actually happens, civil engineering in Scotland will stabilise, not grow, just stabilise. And equally, the Scottish Building Federation was more than a little unconvinced and told us that progress is very slow, and that anyone who suggests that this budget could be a budget for growth in the construction sector is out of touch with reality. So these decisions are the ones that have to be made. You're cutting the housing budget by £66 million, you're reducing the college budget by over £50 million, and you've chosen to take Egypt out of the transport infrastructure spend. These decisions are proof enough for me that, despite Mr Swinney's assertions, whatever this budget is for, it is not a budget for growth.
Thank you. Call Mike Mackenzie, to be followed by Mary Scanlon.
Presiding Officer, it's important when considering any budget to first consider the context, and few people would disagree that this is the worst and the most prolonged economic crisis that any of us has ever experienced. Most commentators also agree that the Westminster Coalition's austerity policies are not working, even some of those who were initially enthusiastic. The best economic wisdom on how to deal with this, with recessions, came from that great English economist, John Maynard Keynes, along with perhaps that of his Canadian counterpart, John Kenneth Galbraith. And what they prescribed was really quite simple. In times of recessions, government should spend on capital projects and on infrastructure and recoup this from taxation in times of growth. No one can end boom and bust, as Gordon Brown boasted, but we can, by this method, take the worst excesses out of the business cycle. This is basic economics. I'm sorry, I've got a lot to get through. This is basic economics, and the real mystery is why the London government doesn't seem to understand this. Far from improving matters, they're making them worse. The economy is flatlining, and government debt, as we've heard just today, is increasing. I'm forced to conclude, Presiding Officer, that they're driven not by economic sense, but by ideology, and that fiscal difficulties are merely providing a cover, an excuse for what they want to do and what they would want to do in any circumstances. What's surprising also is that neither in London nor in Scotland does the Labour Party seem to have any answers, except perhaps for Joanne Lamont's Cuts Commission, which threatens to undo much of the good work that this Parliament has done since its inception. The Labour Party has gone from a situation of wildly exuberant expenditure in government to one where it now seems that they're trying to outflank the Tories on the right. at least in terms of economic stupidity, where each of them fails to understand that economics is not a zero-sum game and that the answer to our current problems is to stimulate and not to weaken demand. What the Labour Party seems also not to recognise is that the Scottish Government does not currently have borrowing powers. The budget is therefore fully funded, and by definition, all measures within it are therefore affordable. No, I'm sorry, I must make progress. If it's their proposition that in the future universal services will be unaffordable, then I cannot see how they can reconcile this with their claim, along with the Tories, that we are better together. Surely what they mean is that we will, according to this vision, be poorer together. I completely reject this proposition. Provided we have control over our own resources, Scotland can look forward to a prosperous future. We're therefore very fortunate in Scotland, Presiding Officer, that we have a Cabinet Secretary who is solely driven by what is best for Scotland and who understands exactly what is required for the Scottish economy. The downside, of course, that he does not yet have fiscal powers or borrowing powers, and the pity is that these are the very tools most needed to deal with our current situation. Under these circumstances, the Scottish Government has taken a very rational approach. The regionalisation of the further education system will offer greater efficiency whilst maintaining college places and quality. The amalgamation of police and fire services offers similar efficiencies while protecting frontline services. No, thank you. I've got a lot to get through. Health and council budgets have been protected, with councils maintaining their share of the Scottish Government funding. Families have been protected by maintaining the council tax freeze. Small businesses by the small business bonus, especially important because some commentators are suggesting that the recovery will come from the small business sector. To manage all this, all of them incidentally manifesto commitments, giving a steeply declining Scottish Government allowance, is impressive. To also find additional capital for a range of capital projects to provide further stimulus is even more so. To deliver these projects, the Forth Road Bridge, for example, under budget, and many others in an efficient manner, whilst ensuring value for the public pound through the Scottish Futures Trust and the NPD mechanism, requires that special discipline that Mr Swinney brings to his work.
Last minute.
It's all the more remarkable, therefore, that the Cabinet Secretary has also found money for a range of preventative spend measures, recognising that it's important to have an eye on the future. I was surprised, though, when the opposition parties have called for evidence of the effectiveness of and the savings created by these preventative spend measures. If you spend, as if in this area you can spend one day and see a result the next day. This merely underpins the feeling that there's a lack of economic understanding on the part of the opposition parties in this chamber. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, I'm pleased to support this budget. Weighing all the circumstances, I think it's a good budget. It's a good budget economically in providing capital stimulus. It's a good budget financially because inevitably the books are balanced. And it's a good budget politically by maintaining manifesto commitments and therefore the trust of the Scottish people.
Thank you. Mary Scanlon, to be followed by Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I would just like to say that after that speech, I'm sure that Mike Mackenzie will be next in line for the next ministerial post, and we look forward to that. I would like to raise 2 points that particularly relate to the Scottish budget. I have to advise the Chamber that they've got nothing to do with constitutional issues, got nothing to do with Labour Party policy, and I'm afraid that neither does my speech relate to the 1919 budget. But the first issue is on the NHS backlog maintenance. This was highlighted in an Audit Scotland report at over £1 billion. However, following scrutiny from the Audit Committee, we now have a clearer picture of the extent of the cost and the extent of the potential harm to patients. The backlog maintenance now totals £773 million, given that properties earmarked for disposal have rightly been taken out of the total, and of course some maintenance was carried out in the last financial year. 17% of the backlog maintenance is high risk, at a cost of £240 million, and 28% is significant risk. The remaining 55% of the total £773 million is medium to low risk. So what does significant risk mean for patients? Well, according to the Scottish Government, this required expenditure in the short term, and it should be effectively managed as a priority so as not to cause undue concern to statutory enforcement bodies or risk to healthcare delivery or safety. But the 17% of expenditure for high risk must be addressed as an urgent priority, and I quote the Scottish Government, to prevent catastrophic failure, major disruption to clinical services or deficiencies in safety liable to cause serious injury and/or prosecution. The Scottish Government, in their own words, expect immediate action to be taken to address the level of risk associated with patient health and safety. So where in the budget is their money for NHS Lanarkshire's £88 million of high-risk backlog maintenance? NHS Lothian's £36 million of high-risk backlog maintenance. Greater Glasgow and Clyde, £21 million, Forth Valley, £19 million, Grampian and Highland, £15 and £14 million, and so on. Presiding Officer, I think that patients and NHS staff across Scotland will want to know when the funding of £240 million for high-risk backlog maintenance will be made available, given that this should be a priority to prevent catastrophic failure, major disruption or deficiencies in safety liable to cause serious injury or prosecution. So whilst there are many other aspects of the health budget worthy of mention in this debate, surely the right to be treated in a clinically safe environment is a top priority. And I ask the Finance Secretary to address this in his winding up. My second point is not a new point. It relates to the 24% cut to further education colleges at a time when youth unemployment remains high, as others have said, with unemployment at 18.5% for 18 to 24-year-olds. Having lectured in further and higher education, lectured in economics, for over 20 years before coming here, I know that this sector has been pared back over the years. Instead of tutorial groups of 15, they became tutorial groups of 45. And in further education, you have a timetable of 24 hours teaching every week degrees, HNC, HND and national certificates. Further education colleges have done more to be flexible and responsive to local needs to widen access to education. They should be praised, not punished for their work. And the standards of degree teaching and further education are excellent, which allows students to articulate after HNC or HND into university courses. It will be so much more difficult in further education to maintain those standards, which allow students to stay at home for the first 2 years of their degree in future, to maintain the standards with a 24% cut, particularly when the majority of the cut will fall in the teaching budget. College teaching grants, according to the NUS briefing paper, will have fallen by £60 million, from £469 in 2010-11 to £409 in 2012-13, £60 million in 3 years. This sector is highly efficient, a drive that progressed after incorporation in 1992 to bring them to the levels of success in training and education, as well as offering the wide range of opportunities to people of all ages across Scotland. Further education addresses inequalities and, as importantly, it embraces the self-esteem and the confidence that individuals need to progress to the world of work. And with 80,000 less places, I pick up the point from Mr Kelly, but Gavin Brown confirmed it. 80,000 less places is 80,000 less opportunities. So finally, Presiding Officer, in 8 seconds I ask the Scottish Government to think again about youth unemployment, inequalities, skills and development, and the backlog maintenance in the NHS, which is potentially harmful to patients.
Thank you. I call Colin Beattie to be followed by Neil Findlay.
Presiding Officer, I frequently listen to the opposition parties seemingly minimising the impact of Westminster budget cuts in the Scottish economy and of the consequent pressures placed on the Scottish budget. The ability of the Scottish Government to maintain spending levels across the board at the same levels as hitherto is simply not possible. You cannot spend more than the allowance you actually receive from Westminster. The opposition parties make much noise when there is a reluctant reduction in funding for sometimes otherwise worthy projects, yet they give no serious indication of where they would propose to impose cuts to retain any particular service above another, and today's contribution by Labour was no different and is clearly simply a press soundbite. Like most MSPs in this chamber, I abhor the approach which the Westminster Government has taken to imposing budget cuts on the Scottish economy. Budget cuts, when taken alongside the so-called welfare reforms, will have the long-term effect of draining liquidity and prosperity from the Scottish economy. The massive reduction in spending power, affecting both the Government, councils and private individuals, hardly creates an environment where private enterprise can flourish and generate the jobs which we so very much need. We are all going to be very much poorer when this long period of badly thought-out austerity eventually ends, following a yes vote in 2014. But no doubt we can consider that financial legacy a dividend from the Union. It is hard to contemplate the extent of the economic illiteracy of the Westminster Government, who seem not to be prepared to listen to either domestic or international wisdom, and this will undoubtedly end in tears. Turning again to the Scottish financial situation, I have to commend the Scottish Government for producing against all the odds a budget which is focused on jobs and economic growth above all. And I am particularly pleased that a strong emphasis has been placed on housing. The Government promised to build 30,000 affordable homes during this term of office. The allocation of an additional £50 million in the budget promises that this pledge will be delivered. The 3-year housing budget has increased by almost £200 million over the past year, with additional investment increasing funding set out in the 2011 Strategic Spending Review by 30%. But I will.
McIntosh.
Is Mr Beattie claiming that over the spending review the housing budget has increased rather than suffering a real-term decrease of £42 million?
Colin Beattie.
According to the figures I've got, the three-year housing budget has increased by almost £200 million, with the additional investment increasing. Yes. Now, while I applaud the efforts made by the Scottish Government to stimulate growth and to create jobs, I can only regret that it does not have the powers to fully manage the economy. These powers, alas, remain in the hands of a Westminster elite who do not seem to understand how to use them to the benefit of the United Kingdom economy. And I believe that every Scottish job which is lost, every Scottish company which closes down, every shop which vanishes from our high streets, I lay firmly in the hands of Westminster. A number of other countries are gradually coming out of recession. We are not, and we now appear to be heading for a triple-dip recession which will create further hardship and distress. And I am appalled at the prospect of current austerity measures continuing until 2017-18. This represents a historically unprecedented 8 years of cuts, and no one actually knows what the result will be at the end. And all I know is that it will be the most vulnerable in our society who will suffer the most and bear the heaviest burden. And I frequently listen to the Labour Party here in Parliament calling that spending be either maintained or increased in certain areas, despite the serious reduction in funding which we have sustained. And this always seemed a rather odd position to take, given that it is well understood that the budget cuts are from Westminster and the Scottish Government has to reduce spending as a result. However, when Labour announced their Cuts Commission, I realised how they proposed to fund these additional commitments, with the reintroduction of prescription charges, with the abolition of concessionary bus travel, by charging students for education, and apparently by pursuing the abolition of charging for some universal services, including personal care. The Scottish Government's commitment to maintain education free at point of delivery shows a singular commitment to maintaining the strong Scottish tradition of making education available to all people, regardless of whether they can afford to pay. As we well know, education forms a significant part of the path out of poverty, and I'm probably a typical example who took full advantage of free education that was available, notwithstanding that my father was a hospital porter and money was a fairly scarce commodity in our house. The long-term economic and social benefit to Scotland of an educated and skilled population should not be underestimated.
Last minute.
Since 2007 until the end of this spending review period, the Government will have invested £5 billion in colleges, and that's some 45% more in cash terms than in the two previous teams of the previous administration. Turning to the health part of the budget, I note that Health Board funding will increase by 3.3% in real terms in 2013-14. That means some £9.1 billion in that year. £390 million will be invested in improving NHS buildings and equipment, £80 million for the integration of health and social care services, £133 million investment for sport and the Commonwealth Games in 2013-14. Now, one legacy which we have is, of course, Labour's love affair with PFI, which has left this government and local authorities across Scotland with a legacy of debt which our children will inherit.
Please come to conclusion.
Another Gordon Brown success story. Presiding Officer, I've only touched on a few key points, but it's clear that this budget is the best that can be achieved given the resources being made available to us by Westminster, and until we have full control over our own affairs and can manage our own economy, there's always going to be a limit on the ability of the Scottish Government to reach its own high aspirations for the people of Scotland. I commend the Government for this budget.
Thank you. Before I call Neil Findlay, I have to say to members I'm going to have to cut them off at 6 minutes. We're running very short of time. Neil Findlay, to be followed by Chick Brodie.
I wish you had done that with some previous speakers, Presiding Officer. For so many of our people, the day-to-day realities of life are not just tough or uncomfortable, but desperately grim, with little immediate prospect of improvement. And in my own region, jobs are being lost on a daily basis, with Halls being the most alarming example. But this week, another 70 jobs were lost in West Lothian alone as a result of the closure of Blockbuster and HMV. And the spectre of welfare reform, in my opinion, the most vindictive piece of legislation in decades, haunts our communities. And it's no exaggeration to say that this will be the cause of people losing their homes, their marriages, and we know, tragically for some people, their lives. We see wages frozen or at best cut, and pension contributions rising with no benefit to those who pay them. The Scottish Government will say all of this has nothing to do with them. And of course, yes, welfare reform is a Westminster issue, and austerity is not at the moment is the policy being driven by the dark forces of the coalition government in London. In fact, maybe this is an opportune time for Mr Rennie.
Just wonder whether Mr Findlay accepts any responsibility for what's happened since they left power. Any responsibility at all?
Neil Findlay.
I think all parties have a responsibility for the situation we're in, because we all tolerated the global financial system that brought us to our knees, and we all said not a lot about it. But, Presiding Officer, there are things that can be done here, and there are still political choices to be made. Unfortunately, all too often, the Scottish Government is making the wrong choices, and all the while blaming it on someone else, because this is part of the referendum game plan. For example, we have the public sector wage freeze. That's their policy. It's their policy choice, as is the council tax policy, which is crippling essential local government services. And we see the disgraceful comments of the Health Secretary, blaming councils on cuts that are a direct consequence of the decisions that he is making in government. As far as the NHS is concerned, we know there are job losses and reductions in staff, pressures to meet targets because of the diminishing staff numbers, shown quite self-evidently by the waiting time scandal and a whole host of other complaints. We see a cherished institution under extreme pressure, yet the Cabinet Secretary and the First Minister repeat the line, the NHS is performing better than ever, patient satisfaction. Not at a moment. You wouldn't take any intervention, so I think you should sit down. Patient satisfaction is at record levels, staff are happier, and there are more of them. Presiding Officer, it just does not reflect the real world. What about housing? In Scotland we have a housing crisis. Sofa surfing is becoming the norm for young people. Far too many children and families are homeless. and people can't access mortgages because they don't have a deposit, and they can't access social housing because they don't have the points and the houses are not available. Yet the Minister will tell us they're building more houses than ever, that waiting lists and homelessness are down and that standards are rising. This, again, does not reflect the real world and the real political choices the government is making. The housing budget was cut by 86 million in real terms. Presiding Officer, the government could have chosen to tackle the housing crisis and at the same time create demand in the economy by putting additional money into housing, but they chose not to. And what about education? The Scottish Government has cut funding in our college sector at the very time we need colleges most. These cuts have led to cuts in jobs, courses and places. Labour's political choice is to support our colleges, to provide our young people with the tools they need to gain employment. And as Mr McIntosh said, we would reinstate the entire funding cut to our colleges, replacing the 34 million that has been taken from them.
Mark MacDonald.
The member has outlined a number of areas where he would want to see increased funding, and he's put figures on some of that. Would he be willing to identify where he would therefore take that money away from in order to fund those increases?
I won't waste any further time of speech because Mr McIntosh already did that. This would also prevent redundancies, and it would prevent the cuts to courses for women and people with learning disabilities. And, Presiding Officer, let's not hear any of the tired, lazy lines from the government backbenchers about being negative and talking down Scotland, because this is the reality for many of their fellow citizens, and they want us to reflect that and not appear detached from the world that they live in. And no amount of spin and bluster from ministers, no amount of sycophantic planted questions from backbenchers or cheerleading speeches from the people behind the Finance Secretary will hide that.
Last minute.
So, in addition to replacing the college budget, Mr Swinney, we ask you to invest in housing through the Barnett Consequentials and, as Mr McIntosh has explained, kick-starting construction and creating jobs. And we would also ask to reinstate the cuts to the Egypt project through the borrowing against the regulated asset base to pay for projects like the Dalmeny Cord in my area, which would stimulate developments like Winchborough Station in the core development area where it lies. These are practical steps that we could take. Unemployment, colleges, construction, housing and transport, these are our political priorities, and I believe they're the people's priorities. It's just a shame they're not the government's priorities.
Thank you. Call Chick Brodie to be followed by Willie Rennie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I support the principles of the budget bill before us, and it will be passed. Why? Not only because it addresses the challenges facing us, but because there is no valued alternative budget before us. I said in the budget debate 2 weeks ago that the opposition, particularly Labour's priorities, may be different to ours, and that is a perfectly honest and respectable position to hold and to be debated. What is not acceptable, however, not respectful of the people who sent us here, is to whinge and whinge about the budget. This budget builds priorities without stating clearly enunciated and valued alternatives. And Mr McIntosh, after his litany about rail and housing and rail, at the weekend added town centre regeneration projects to his list that needed additional money. So we have limited time. I repeat, let me develop and then we'll take it. I repeat that the opposition aspires to reduce or increase the costs or revenue elements of the budget bill, or questions its general principles, or wants to change its recommendations, all perfectly respectable. But tell us what your priorities, your principles and your programmes, properly and financially evaluated as a full budget in the round are. I address to Mr McIntosh and the Labour opposition because this maxty hodgepodge of a coalition has no cohesive budget policies other than those of the economic piranhas. Yes.
Ian Gray.
I thank Mr Brodie for taking the intervention to try and help him, because I know he wasn't here, but for 8 years in opposition, can he tell us on how many occasions the SNP actually brought forward an amendment to the budget bill? I think the answer is once.
Chick Brodie.
If Mr Gray says that, I'll check that and say it. But I would say to him that it's sometimes better to stay seated in the event you might be thought foolish than to stand and confirm it. What I have to say is to Labour is don't, and I think you are, hitching your interest to the coalition wagon, whose financial wheels are coming off. And I can't believe how the party of Keir Hardie can find itself as economic bedfellows, be it political better together, on universal benefits, on council tax, or whatever, of a London government which assaults the lower paid at the expense of the rich few. Presiding Officer, Scotland or the UK, not just now, like it or not, is about to enter a triple-dip recession and a huge borrowing, which, given the current economic and constitutional structure, limits Scotland's options and mitigates against our national performance outcomes, be they GD performance.
The member said that the coalition was assaulting the low paid. Can he explain why the coalition then is increasing the tax threshold to £10,000?
Check Brodie.
Look at, I was about to say, as Mr MacDonald, look at the budget figures and look at the impact that welfare reform is going to have on the low paid and on the poor in this country. Presiding Officer, Scotland, as I say, is about to enter this triple dip recession, which will impact all of the performance outcomes which we seek to cover, whether it be GDP, productivity improvement, or carbon emissions, and so on. I believe that even in those straitened times and circumstances, the Cabinet Secretary and his team have given continued focus to those objectives in the budget. A DL budget which in real terms, Mr Brown, is reduced by 0.4%. Yet it still maintains, I would argue, the principles and priorities, the foundation to be ready when the upturn comes and when we have our hands on the levers of fiscal and monetary powers. The principles are absolutely right. Economic policies take a long cycle to be effective, and to get money and activity into the economy quickly is important. That's why the shift from resource to capital is right, because leakage in the former is much more problematic and immediate than it is in the latter. You cannot invigorate the economy through a consumption financed by debt. Investment in assets, capital investment, will help us pay down our deficit earlier and improve our assets and infrastructure for the long term. It is right that we target expenditure on the training and retraining, particularly the young unemployed, but all we get from the opposition is the mantra of college cuts. Well, I say this to you. A country, any country, that has an economy that does not seek and manage change, that does not look to produce efficiencies, will die. It will die. And I say to the two main opposition parties that their antediluvian pursuit and competitive animosities, throwing money at problems or making cuts unwittingly, is not the solution to creating a dynamic economy. The Rodgers and Hammerstein show of anything you can do, I can do better, or in this case worse, is over. These days are over. Presiding Officer, I believe this budget establishes quite clearly fairness, capital investment, supporting business, in particular small businesses, investing in our energy future and the green economy, supporting skills and training for our young people, better housing and physical infrastructure. All of these, I believe, the budget bill addresses.
Conclude, please.
We in this party do not see, as Mr McIntosh does, a difficulty in every opportunity. Rather, we see an opportunity in every difficulty.
Thank you. And I call Willie Rennie to be followed by Rob Gibson.
I think I welcome Chick Brodie's contribution, actually, because he was making the case for many of the reforms that the coalition government are implementing. What is it? A government that does not seek and manage efficiencies will die. But then proceeded to actually say we should not build an economy on debt. But it's his exact party that are proposing increasing borrowing, driving up the cost of borrowing, costing us more, driving up interest rates, increasing our mortgage costs. No, not just now. That is his contribution was a direct contradiction, an assault on the poor, when the Liberal Democrats and the Conservative in partnership are increasing the tax thresholds for the poor in a way that the Labour Party never did in all their time in power. Mr Brodie, I think, should read back his speech, because he'll find he has been converted to our cause, and he may wish once again to join the Liberal Democrats. Mr Swinney's budget, I think we had a good discussion. I think last week I was I welcomed the opportunity to put forward our proposals for change. He's a man who's keen on balanced budgets and good housekeeping. In fact, I actually think he may support Chick Brodie in his efforts to keep efficiencies and seek and manage change. Perhaps he's in the same boat. But we welcome that discussion, because I think it's important that we try to work constructively. We did last year, and we will seek to constructively work again to seek an agreement. And we highlighted two areas. First was on college funding. We're back in the NUS campaign, as we did last year. We think it's worthy of consideration that extra £35 million should be put back into the budget to reverse the cuts. That's something that we'll support, especially when colleges are playing an essential role at trying to train people, upskill people, ready for the jobs that will come when the economy recovers. And it's important that I think that Mr Swinney reflects upon that, and if he does, we will look, not just now. He's got a cheek. Not one intervention. Not one intervention. I don't think so. No, not just now. So we will support the budget if we can secure issues like the colleges and the extra funding, because the colleges do play an important role in making sure that we have the workforce ready for boosting the economy. And likewise, and we would link this to the economy as well, that we would support extra investment so that the 2-year-olds in Scotland, 40% we would say of the poorest 2-year-olds should get 15 hours of nursery education each week. Nobel laureate James Heckman, you've heard me saying and refer to him numerous times, he says that the highest return on investment in education is before the age of 3. That's when you can make the biggest impact. You can determine somebody's outcome at the age of 26. Before the age of 2, if you make the right investment at that time. Now, the Scottish Government so far has committed to 1% of 2-year-olds getting free childcare and education for 2-year-olds. We think that's good, but we think we need to move up to 40%. Now, we recognise that can't all be done in one fell swoop, that you have to phase it over a period of time. The UK Government's looking to do 20% by September this year, and then increasing it to 40% at a later stage. And we hope that Mr Swinney will accept that request from ourselves and back this plan for his budget. We think they're modest proposals that are worthy of consideration. We're not going to come up with a long, long list of proposals, which Mr Finlay seemed to be attracted to without any ability for how to pay for it. We will come forward with sensible proposals that we think the Scottish Government can afford, not just now, can afford. There's a £32 billion budget. We reckon within that budget it's certainly possible to find this amount of money, and including, in response to my intervention earlier on, Mr Swinney highlighting the additional resources that may be available from business rates in this financial year. So we reckon the money is available, can be invested in these two important areas, in colleges, but also in early intervention. We welcomed the £50 million additional funding for social housing. We think that's a good investment. There's a desperate need for additional social housing in Scotland, and we think that was a good investment. If I could return to an issue that I've raised previously with Mr Swinney, is about the local government floor. Aberdeen Council were guaranteed an 85% of the average council spending within Scotland. This is now dropped to 79%. And Mr Swinney's tried to explain it to me, but I must admit I find it difficult to understand how this calculation can only be made at the start of the spending process. The guarantee was for 85%, but Aberdeen next year will only have 79%, and 79% is lower than 85%, so it's gone through the floor. I would hope that Mr Swinney could reflect upon this and consider this as a sensible proposal to meet a commitment that he and many others made in election campaigns and beyond. So those are reasonable suggestions. College funding, nursery education. We will work constructively with the government to achieve that. If they deliver on what we wish, then we will vote with it. We're not afraid to do that. If it's good enough, we'll be with it. Thank you.
Thank you. Call Rob Gibson, to be followed by Helen Eadie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The budget process that we're discussing just now does not take place in isolation from the Scottish economy. Just yesterday, Donald McRae, the chief economist at the Bank of Scotland, believes that the data about the labour market indicates that the Scottish economy is moving in the right direction. Indeed, the labour market surge suggests the economy on the right path, is the headline in the Herald article. It's indicating that for a whole series of months, indeed for the last 8, we're at the highest level of job creation and placement at the present time. Permanent job placement in Scotland increased at its strongest rate in 8 months, and that suggests to me that it's a figure which is beating that of the United Kingdom, which this inquiry also looks at. When we think about the fact that this improvement has risen to a factor of 56 in December, it shows that the link between investing capital in supporting the development of productive industry is a major factor in the way in which this economy goes forward, and that this budget backs the real economy in Scotland. The two are linked on that point.
Willie Rennie.
Any credit at all to the UK Government for contributing to what he says?
Rob Gibson.
Well, I'm just coming on to the subject of renewable energy support, and indeed the Scottish Government in that has shown an absolutely solid, consistent approach. The attitude of the coalition in London is all over the place. The wobbles have made it difficult for people to see the way forward for the long-term investments that are required in this vital industry. And in our discussions about this budget, we're talking about the long-term development of steady jobs, of a way in which it's possible for people to spend more money, so that when you've got engineering developing, when you've got jobs like at Global Energy increased in my constituency in Nig, yesterday's view that 300 jobs at Subsea 7 in Aberdeen and at Wick in working on a project for Shell's Fram development, it will allow people who are in these permanent jobs to spend money in the shops and create the potential for actually taking up the slack of people who have yet to get into work because of the worldwide recession and the austerity projects of the UK Government. So let me suggest that it's important in the budget here to recognise that the Scottish Government backs energy development to the hilt as one of the key means to go forward, and that the UK Government is left trailing. Now, I welcome the fossil fuel levy surplus being used to establish a renewable energy investment fund, because the way that the Green Energy Bank has been set up, it could in fact not be playing to Scotland's strengths. I also support the renewable infrastructure development in the capital infrastructure plans. In other words, we're helping creating the potential in our ports and harbour areas and industries for the next stage. But I turn to the area in which my own committee deals with, the rural development budget, and recognise that indeed, as far as education is concerned, 56 million of our rural budget goes into the research approach to the rural economy. Now, that's supporting the rural college university, supporting research in many other parts of the university sector, and that food and drink and indeed the success of much of the rural economy is contributing to the strength in the future. At the present, we're building upon that in this budget. The Sustainable Action Fund, 15 million. The Agri-Environment Resources, 38 million. 1.7 million for research into peat re-wetting, which I couldn't possibly fail to quote at this time. Welcomed by Stuart Housden, the Director of the RSBB Scotland. Good to see John Swinney outline Scottish Government spending on peatland restoration for climate and diversity benefits. That creates jobs. That creates skilled jobs. For example, in the Environmental Research Institute in Thurso, which gives its full backing as a hub for international support in the development of this, young Scots are training to become the scientists of the future that will save the planet and help others in this country and others to do so. And the opposition, has got an approach to short-termism that is unbelievably blinkered. We're looking at the kinds of suggested changes which are fiddling while Rome burns. The United Kingdom Government, as I said before, has been equivocal on Scotland's renewable potential. Scott's budget backs job creation for development in a developing economy, which I've laid out some of the parts of earlier. We're limited in our reach under devolution. When we're ruled by austerity Osborne and cost-cutter Cameron, what's the alternative? They are the people who are holding Scotland back. This budget gives Scotland a sound, common sense approach, giving people confidence in the SNP's competence on the road to full powers. And it's essential in this particular year that we keep on track, because Scotland is moving forward, it's moving in the right direction, and the SNP government backs that to the hilt with this budget.
Thank you. I now call Helen Eadie to be followed by Mark MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I start by empathising with the Cabinet Secretary. I have no doubt that the choices that he has to make are extraordinarily difficult choices. But I think that, for members of the governing party to characterise the Labour Party in the way that it has done is totally unreal, because the very opening remarks of Ken Macintosh were to say that we have more that unites us than actually divides us in this. And the fact about short-termism, well, I would dispute that, because the very fact that the Labour Party in its last term of office up to 2007 legislated for the type of intermodal rail connections, which are things that we don't have in this country. We can go to Zurich, we can go to Strasbourg, we can go to Munich, we can go to airports all over Europe where we see grand schemes that are intermodal rail links. We don't have one in Scotland, and I think that's a tragedy that we have that.
Stuart Stevenson.
I recognise what is being said. Can the member give us the name of an airport anywhere in Europe, other than in Scotland, that failed to make a financial contribution to its being connected to any rail network?
Helen Eadie. I would take notice of that question and get back to the member, because I think it's possible that there have been situations, maybe he knows better as the former Transport Secretary, but I'm going to be constructive as I possibly can be today, and I'm going to ask the Cabinet Secretary, John Swinney, if he will look at the committee papers concerning the European funding that were put to the last committee of the European and External Affairs Committee, because I really do think they would be worth his while doing that, because there's not a soul, I'm sure, in this chamber is not acutely aware of the fact that what we really need in all of this debate is new money. It's not about, I recognise that trying to rejig the monies that we have is an impossible situation for him. And can I say, when I'm looking at new money, some of the things that really hit me when I was reading that paper, why is it, for example, that the Scottish Government have never applied for, since 2007, any monies at all from the European Globalisation Fund? They could have had up to £500 million a year from the European Globalisation Fund. That would have been new money. That is about when you've got large-scale redundancies, as we've had in Halls, where Neil Finlay and his colleagues have worked so hard in West Lothian Council. Why is it that nobody's done that? Because £500 million, as has been said over and over again in this chamber, would have made an enormous difference. And I'm going to ask the Cabinet Secretary, when he looks at that paper, is he going to commission and give a really high status to a task group that will look at European funding right across the piece? Because if you look at those papers from the European Committee, you will see that there was 189.8 million was going at a begging for the Civil Protection Fund. Now, I remember at Glasgow Airport we had a major terrorism attack. How much money did we apply for out of that fund to deal with that situation? We had the Solidarity Fund that we could have been applying for. There's 75 million available in that. That's to deal with natural man-made disasters like flooding and all the other issues that we have. And then if you look at the green programmes that we hear so much about from our Green Party colleagues, that should be really high on their agenda, has been rightly said by colleagues in the Greens. There's £450 million going a begging from Marco Polo funding. And if you look at the framework for research and development, 50 £60 billion, and we've only ever applied for £374 million. Now, that isn't because we don't have the brains in Scotland to do it, but you need a government to show leadership. You need a government to be galvanised enough to go in there and to be able to really get the best brains in Scotland to sit down together and apply for all this funding, because you've got two strands of funding. You've got the fixed funding that comes out of the multi-annual financial framework. That's one area that you can do very little about once it's agreed in Europe. But you've also got the competitive funding, which is the funding that I'm talking about. And when we're talking about the billions of pounds, I hear time and time again in this chamber about broadband, and we hear in committees and we hear in cross-party groups. There's £28 billion going a-begging across Europe. What are we doing to access all of that money with industry and with research and with academia?
Maureen Watt.
I thank Helen Eadie for giving way, and certainly in terms of the broadband money, as a member of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee, I think they find that the government is accessing that. But in terms of the other streams which she identified, can you tell us how much of that needs to be match funded by monies from here and where that money would come from?
Helen Eadie.
Some of that money can be accessed directly through community initiative money, which means that you get 100% funding. I don't know how many local authorities in Scotland have done that. I don't know how many voluntary organisations have done that. But, for example, I bring a message from Fife Council. Fife Council, a meeting with the leader, Alex Rowley, with Jane Baxter and other colleagues who were at that meeting, said at that meeting that he would welcome the possibility if the Cabinet Secretary were to make the shovel-ready project money much more flexible, that their council would match pound for pound. Now, how many local authorities across Scotland are doing that? That's Fife's Labour-led local authority is willing to match fund with the Cabinet Secretary. So there is much that we can do to be constructive, Presiding Officer, and I really do think that I would appeal most strenuously, if I have nothing else to say today, is will the Cabinet Secretary please get a working group established, high level, high status, to access that money from Europe. Billions of pounds.
Many thanks. That's terrific. Thank you very much. I now call on Mark MacDonald to be followed by Patrick Harvick. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. If I can say, in response to Willie Rennie, I'm sure as a former Aberdeen City Councillor he would expect me to be taking a keen interest. And I've also spoken to the Cabinet Secretary, and I think the explanation which he gave around the 3-year funding settlement, I think, is entirely satisfactory. It would require the whole funding settlement to be reopened with COSLA. But it's not just me who's satisfied, because the front page of the Evening Express recently quite clearly stated that a guarantee from the Council administration that there would be no cuts in this coming financial year. That would suggest to me that not only is Aberdeen receiving a good level of funding from the Scottish Government, it's also a testimony to the record of the previous administration, and I was in administration with colleagues of Willie Rennie, in terms of getting the finances of that council back in order. This is a budget, I think, that will deliver. I think it is a strong budget which delivers on the priorities that the Scottish Government has set out. The Cabinet Secretary has spoken about maintaining college places, which is the statement which we made quite clear, is that we would maintain them at 2011-12 levels. We also have an emphasis on capital investment, and there is also support for jobs and economic growth. But don't just take my word for it. Let's listen to some of the remarks which were made following the announcement that the Cabinet Secretary made. We had Robin Parker of the NUS who stated that this budget would deliver the best student support package in the UK, including the minimum income of £7,250, the educational maintenance allowance protected, no tuition fees, and that bursaries would be protected at the higher level which NUS Scotland had been campaigning for. We had Andy Willocks of the Federation of Small Businesses stating, having highlighted the need to support the private sector to create new jobs on the scale now required, we welcome the £15 million Youth Employment Initiative, and new capital spending is good. We had Liz Cameron, the Chief Executive of Scottish Chambers of Commerce, saying Scottish businesses welcome John Swinney's stated objective of prioritising economic growth, welcome the continued focus the Government places on the maximisation of capital spending and infrastructure investment. And even the CBI Scotland hidden away within their press release a number of positive announcements on construction, tourism, skills and incentives for firms to recruit young people. And finally, Michael Levac, the Chief Executive of the Scottish Building Federation, the additional boost the Cabinet Secretary has given to the capital budget today is hugely welcome. But he also recognised that the UK Government must do more to rectify the situation and demonstrate its own commitment to stimulating economic recovery. And that was before the additional capital investment that the Cabinet Secretary outlined as a result of the consequentials in December. So to say that there is not support out there for the work that the Scottish Government is doing, frankly, flies in the face of the testimony of these individuals and these organisations to that very effect. But we cannot ignore the elephant in the room, Presiding Officer. And Willie Rennie did say about the impact of the UK budget on low-income families. And I say to him to go away and look at the figures produced by his own government in terms of their budget figures, which show quite clearly the detriment that will be visited upon those of low incomes by the budget policies that his party is supporting in government at Westminster. And when he does that, I hope he will come back and admit that the UK Government's budget measures are going to negatively impact on the lowest paid in our society and the low-income households in our society. And we must add into that welfare reform. One of the great misconceptions around welfare reform is that it doesn't impact on those in work, but we already have heard much evidence, both to the Welfare Reform Committee here in Parliament and also in wider society, that there are many people in low-income jobs, many low-paid individuals who rely on benefits as well as the income that they receive. They are going to be negatively impacted upon as a result of UK Government policies. And while the Scottish Government can mitigate to some extent within the powers that we have here, we simply cannot wipe out some of those negative impacts, and that is going to be detrimental. And surely, Mr Rennie, you must accept that.
Willie Rennie.
He says about welfare, but what would he do instead? What changes would he make? Has he got any idea about what kind of welfare system he would have?
The first principle of any welfare system should be that it is built on fairness. I see no fairness whatsoever in the approach that is being taken, because it's not driven by a fairness agenda, it is driven by a cost-cutting agenda, and I don't think that that should be the primary focus. Indeed, if the UK Government were to spend half as much time pursuing tax loopholes and tax avoidance as it seems to spend pursuing those who are most vulnerable and low-paid in society, they might find that there would be little need for some of these draconian measures to take place. Instead, they're all too quick to approach those who don't have the big pockets in our society and make them the scapegoats for their failed economic approach. And what say the Labour Party in this Parliament, Presiding Officer? You know, I understand that opposition can be an easy gig, in the sense that all you have to do is stand up and promise the moon on a stick to everyone, and that will make you popular with them. But it's not enough for the Labour Party to simply turn around and say that they want to spend more money on housing, more money on further education, more money on transport, more money on local government, and to only identify unidentified efficiency savings and underspends as being the way that would result. Oh, sorry, and also the Ryder Cup trip would be used, or as they call it in Glasgow Labour, a payoff. That's what they essentially have highlighted today as being the way to resolve all of the difficulties that the Scottish Government faces. Frankly, Presiding Officer, it is nothing more than the politics of dishonesty, and unless they have some proper proposals to bring to the table, nobody's going to take them seriously.
Many thanks. Now calling Patrick Harvey to be followed by John Mason. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'd like to address some of the economic context and the arguments that have been put so far in the debate, and then move on to a couple of specifics, including colleges and climate change. We've heard the name of Keynes mentioned a couple of times during the debate, including by some SNP members who seem to be using the argument for economic stimulus to justify and back up the case for the Cabinet Secretary's decision to transfer resources from the revenue to the capital budgets. And yet in making that case, they then go on, some of them almost in the next breath, to talk about the constraints that exist in a Scottish budget. We don't have the ability to borrow. It's not a real independent government. And they know that I agree with the conclusions that we would like to reach about having all of those powers here. But the reality is that within a fixed budget and without the ability to borrow, that investment in capital cannot provide the classic Keynesian stimulus that they're talking about. We have the amount of money that we have available to us. We can choose how we spend it and how we don't. The other difference that we're facing from what I think Keynes was talking about was that in this world, in the modern world, this aggressively globalised, free market and deregulated world, there's much greater leakage from capital expenditure into other parts of the global economy. We don't get all of the benefits. And I don't share all of the arguments that Labour would make about the Forth Road Bridge, because they were the ones who supported the deregulation, the globalisation and the approach to procurement, which is part of the constraints that we have at the moment. But the reality is that leakage does take place. Now, I'm not saying that there is no case for this transfer, this emphasis on capital expenditure. And certainly if we were looking at a dramatic investment in socially rented housing, I see that Mr Mackenzie is back from the wee lie down that he went for after he was so fatigued by the cut and thrust of all of those interventions he took. So I'll certainly let him in.
Mike Mackenzie.
Thank you for taking an intervention. Do you accept the OBR
Microphone, please.
Do you accept the OBR figures that suggest that capital expenditure gives a multiplier of 1 compared to 0.6 for revenue that Mr Swinney outlined in his speech?
Patrick Harvey.
I've said I accept there's a case for doing this if the investment is in the right places. But Mr Mackenzie's own speech then talked about part of the problem with economic recovery is a failure of demand. Now, if we were to take one alternative approach to this, we would be putting, instead of having such a massive transfer from revenue to capital, we would be spending a bit more on the public sector pay bill. Low-paid workers delivering public services that all of us depend on in Scotland, getting at least something closer to a real-term stability in their pay packets. And that would be money that would be less likely to leak out into other countries. It would be benefiting local economies right across Scotland. Now, I just say that there is a case for doing this. And also a lower transfer from revenue to capital would give us the ability to protect other priorities such as colleges. And I do want to emphasise to the Cabinet Secretary that this is not just the NUS raising the concerns about college cuts. It's not just the many hundreds of students around the country who've been emailing all of us, I'm sure, over recent weeks to raise these issues. When you have agreement right across all of the opposition parties in this chamber, who come to the issue from different political standpoints but can agree on this one thing, I do think the Cabinet Secretary should listen to that pressure and make every effort that he can to give some ground on the issue of the college cuts, and I urge him to respond to that in his closing speech. The final issue that I'd like to raise in my last couple of minutes, Deputy Presiding Officer, is on climate change. Last year, just before the summer recess, it was announced that the Government had failed to meet the first ever annual target under the Climate Change Act. Now, we can debate whether that's all their own fault, whether they could have done more, whether it's all the weather, but the point is that the legislation requires an amendment, a revision to the Government's existing programme of policies and proposals under the Climate Change Act. It requires that revision as soon as reasonably practicable after the target has been, the failure to meet the target has been announced. Here we are in January, that revision hasn't yet been made. And without that revision, without knowing what the Government's short-term policies are to make up the lost ground and get us back on track for the climate change targets, it is impossible to know whether the figures in this document adequately fund the Government's own climate change. I'm sorry, I'm in my last few moments, I don't have time. It's impossible to know whether the figures in this document adequately fund the Government's own policies when we don't know what they are. Now, the Government does still have time, just about, to make that announcement and lay the revisions before Parliament in advance of the Stage 3 vote, hopefully in advance of the Stage 2 scrutiny as well. And if the Government is able to do that, then we'll be able to judge whether or not the climate change targets are adequately being funded in the current budget. Until that happens, it is impossible to know, Presiding Officer, and so it's impossible for anyone who prioritises that issue to vote for the budget as yet.
Thanks very much. Now call on John Mason to be followed by Margaret McDougall. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think we are all agreed that it's disappointing that we're in this position where we have so much that we would like to do in society and we do not have the resources to do it. And once again, we've had this afternoon a lot of criticism and I think really very few positive suggestions. Some of the ideas that we've had as to where the money might come from, efficiencies, savings, underspends, a review of IT, fewer spin doctors. It's all really tinkering round the edges. And I've been there before, Glasgow City Council. These were the kind of things I used to say if I couldn't think of a better amendment for the council budget. Some of the others appeared to be more serious, for example, the NPD programme. But I think the point was missed, perhaps, that the funding for that is ring-fenced. It's for a particular project, and the fact that one project is postponed does not mean that funding is available for another project, as we heard at the Finance Committee the other week. And the Edinburgh-Glasgow train links as well, I think the point again has been missed that if we could do something better than was proposed and do it cheaper, then that is a better investment. It's not about spending money for the sake of it. It's about just let me finish this point. It's about spending money for the best. And if we can get a longer train running between Edinburgh and Glasgow, that is a much better opportunity. I would suggest better for the environment as well, and a cheaper option and possibly a better option. Mary Scanlon.
I thank the member very much for giving me. I'm sorry I ran out of time to give some of my options, but there was one given by the Auditor General, and that was in terms of the mergers of colleges. Now, rather than cutting the money to colleges, we would have hoped that there would be some savings in terms of economies of scale in these mergers. The Auditor General couldn't find any.
John Mason.
Yes, well, I know that Mike Russell will have to answer for himself, but he's adamant that there will be savings from mergers, but I think everybody accepts that will not be in year one. That will be later on, and City of Glasgow College is an example of that. The question then is not, would we all like more money to create more jobs? Because we can all answer yes to that. The question is there another way to use the money that is available to create more jobs? And frankly, we have heard precious little about that this afternoon. Now, to be fair, there have been a few people who have suggested options. The Equal Opportunities Committee, along with, I think, Patrick Harvey, have questioned the whole idea about the move to construction, but for slightly different reasons. The Equal Opportunities Committee is concerned that that favours men rather than women. But to be fair, that is a real alternative. And to give Gavin Brown his due, we do accept that he is happy to cut universal benefits, and that money can be used for other things. By contrast, we have not heard from Labour this afternoon that they would cut universal benefits and use that money for other things. Yes?
Claudia Beamish.
Does the member agree with me that, as put forward by Scottish Labour, an expanded retrofit programme would help tackle fuel poverty, also address climate change issues and bring jobs to the local economy, which is going back to the point which the member had made about jobs?
Yes, but that is exactly the point I'm making, that we would all like to spend money on these things. Nobody's disagreeing with her that these are great things. Retrofit, absolutely, in my constituency, tenement flats. But where is that money to come from? And I'll touch a little bit on preventive spending if I do get time as we move through. I think we have to accept that we face tensions or we face choices. Twice since we last met, on Friday and Monday, I was in the Lighthouse in Glasgow, and I think Patrick Harvey was the only other MSP who was at both events. But on Friday we looked at economic policy, women economic policy and constitutional change, and the tensions in there, and what can we do about the widening gap between men and women if more money is put into construction and if that helps men, which I'm not sure is absolutely certain. And then secondly, yesterday we had the Joseph Rowntree Foundation giving their presentation on poverty. And one of the questions we were asked was, what would you do in 2 years to cut poverty? And then that immediately creates the tension between short-term and longer-term. And there's these other tensions. Do we put more into housing and take it out of other capital investment? If we're going to put more into colleges, does that mean we're taking something out of the universities? On preventative spending, I think we have seen an attempt by this government to switch expenditure to a more preventative approach. And that's a way of thinking that I think is welcomed by all parties, especially when we're sitting in committee. But we have to accept that if we are successful in preventative spending, it will probably mean in the long run fewer hospitals and fewer prisons. And we all have to accept then that we should not be out there to defend hospitals if they are not needed, or prisons if they are not needed. Yet the opposition parties do have a tendency to squeal when anything like that is actually suggested. Presiding officer, from a Glasgow point of view, I certainly want to welcome the investment in the Commonwealth. I've had two already, I think that's enough, in the Commonwealth Games. Clyde Gateway and the investment in the new office development that's happening there with the aim of building up jobs in the East End is very, very welcome. Now, it's always possible to suggest improvements to how any government can spend its money, but I think the government here is in stark contrast with Glasgow City Council and the muddle it seems to be in these days. Spending £15 million on George Square was absolute madness when everyone else is tightening their belts. And for Labour councillors running a charity like GERA, intended to be helping a needy area, to pay £500,000 to their chief executive is bordering on criminal. We have not heard any better suggestions, and therefore I am more than happy to support this budget. Thank you.
Many thanks. Now call on Margaret McDougall to be followed by Jean Urquhart. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I wish to focus on housing because its budget is being hit harder than any other. The overall housing budget has gone from £1.3 billion in 2010-12 to £770 million in the 2013-15 period, which means house building will fall from 22,205 to 18,000 units. No one can argue that this is a significant cut. And yet, housing is expected to generate around £3 billion of economic activity and support up to 8,000 jobs each year, directly and indirectly, across the Scottish economy. So much more could be done if the whole £331 million in capital spend available through the autumn statement consequentials were put into the housing budget over the next 2 years. More to stimulate, if you just give me a minute, Mr Gibson, more to stimulate the economy and more to move thousands of people into employment.
Kenneth Gibson.
Intervention. Do you agree, therefore, that the £5.2 million that John Swinney has allocated to Irvine Bay Urban Regeneration Company should not go to them, but should instead be allocated, as Mr McIntosh suggested, through NPD projects?
That should be paid through the Scottish Investment Trust. If I can just continue, I'm not going to be lectured on housing by certain SNP individuals, where this statement we've got today from John Swinney, the Finance Committee response from the Finance Minister is a total of 8 lines. So that's just how much the SNP think about the housing. The affordable housing supply budget faces a considerable cut, going from £235.5 million to £196.2 million, which is a total cut of £39.3 million. Even when we take into account the additional £50 million Barnett formula money announced just before Christmas. According to the Capital Investment and Infrastructure Committee report to the Finance Committee, the cut to housing capital is larger than the overall cut to capital spend in Scotland during the current review period. And while this... Sorry, I've taken one intervention, I don't have time to take another. The cut to housing capital is larger than the overall cut to capital spend in Scotland during the current review period. And while this draft budget does go a little way to improving it, the cuts to housing still remain higher than average. This budget could also be potentially devastating to housing associations who are already struggling to find new projects, due to the cuts to the current Housing Association grant from £70,000 to £40,000 a unit. Many housing associations have argued this level of HAG funding is unsustainable. It is all very well to say housing associations should spend their reserves, as Alec Neil did last year, but they can only do that once. I agree with the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee, who have called on the Scottish Government to review the HAG level and set out alternatives so housing associations don't fall below planned development levels, which would jeopardise their sustainability. According to the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations, small housing associations of those or those in rural areas simply can't afford to develop with the lower grant levels, as it is more costly to build in rural areas and the cost of loans is more expensive for smaller associations because lenders are less willing to lend or the rates are prohibitive. All of this means in the vast majority of cases development just stops. This in turn leads to a shortfall in housing stock in areas that need it most. So with cash-strapped councils, cuts to HAG, lenders being risk-averse, it is hard to see how we will meet affordable housing building targets. And yet, according to government figures, the first year of the programme saw the target of 6,000 exceeded by 800. This could be because data is being presented differently. Shelter note that overall the number of starts has fallen from 4,800 in 2010-11 to 3,366 in 2011-12. Given the time lag in all that, I think that we are heading for a cliff edge with regard to new completions in the next few years." End quote. We need to be confident we have the exact figures, so we need more transparency in the way these figures and the associated data is collected, counted and presented, with sufficient breakdowns of approvals, starts and completions and their timings to ensure there is no double counting. Presiding Officer, there is much more I could say on the travesty of cutting the housing budget so severely, but to conclude, we need a housing budget which is more sustainable, which will stimulate the economy through the construction industry and provide much-needed apprenticeships for young people, which it is crying out for. We need to review HAG funding so housing associations can build homes for those in most need where they are needed. We need to build houses particularly to address the mismatch of housing which councils and housing associations face.
Now, please.
I'm just closing. So we need to extend the retrofit programme to make them more efficient and to reduce fuel poverty. And this budget, which is cutting the housing budget by higher than the average, is not going to do that.
Thanks very much. Now call on Jean Urquhart, up to 6 minutes, please, after which we'll move to closing speeches.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Well, I would like to use the time that I have in this Stage 1 debate just to reflect on the difficult choices faced by the Cabinet Secretary and the Government in preparing this budget. I'm mindful of Professor David Bell's conclusion in his report on the budget back in September that the Cabinet Secretary is largely constrained by the settlement from the UK Government, which in turn reflects its policy towards the UK's current fiscal deficit. In the face of these constraints, and as I said in the Finance Committee debate on the draft budget before Christmas, I fully support the Cabinet Secretary's budget for 2013-14 and the choices that he has made. We don't have the flexibility of normal countries, and as our budget is handed to us from on high, restoring money, for example, to our colleges, would mean cuts elsewhere, cuts that others have failed to outline or propose. In many instances, the choice we have is Sophie's choice, where money that can be used in so many different areas cannot be allocated to them all. I was pleased to see the Cabinet Secretary's thoughtful and considered written response to the Finance Committee's report that was debated in the Chamber on December 20th, which has answered many of the points raised in our report, and I was particularly heartened by the economic impact of public sector investment in next-generation broadband outlined by the Government, with almost 14,000 indirect jobs being created between 2013 and 2028. And it may seem a long period of time, but the ambition is welcome. As a Highlands and Islands representative, the Cabinet Secretary's recognition of the need to deliver improved connectivity to areas where next-generation speeds are not yet possible was also very welcome. A reliable broadband service in the Highlands and Islands would be the greatest gift this budget could deliver the region, as it would open up opportunities for small and medium-sized enterprises currently at a disadvantage due to their geographic location. It's no use having super-fast broadband in Kilmarnock if Cotality doesn't even have dial-up service, and the Government's commitment to all parts of Scotland is to be lauded. I was also glad to hear, in response to recommendations made by the EET Committee, more detail of the work the Government is undertaking on public procurement. As Jim and Margaret Cuthbert attested to in their evidence to the committee, Germany's strategy of breaking down larger contracts into smaller chunks to enable small and medium-sized enterprises to bid for them is eminently sensible, and given the preponderance of SMEs in the Scottish economy, is an idea I would be keen to see the Government continue to consider as part of its bid to make the most of what we have. As a member of the Finance Committee that did pass its report on the budget, I hope to see the helpful and constructive tone of our committee's evidence sessions extended to the Chamber. In taking evidence from various organisations and from other committees, I think that every member was even more acutely aware of the difficult decisions faced in these difficult times. I'm convinced that the Cabinet Secretary has produced the best possible deal for Scotland, but I look forward to more positive, constructive and costed suggestions from the opposition on how they would propose to improve it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Gavin Brown as we move to the closing speeches. Mr Brown, just 6 minutes or thereby, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Let me respond to a couple of points in the debate before moving forward to focus specifically, I think, on the NPD model, which really ought to be examined more closely than some of the sound bites we've had thus far, particularly responses from the Government. We had an interesting contribution from the convener of the Finance Committee, Mr Kenneth Gibson, back to his best angry form, in contrast to the conciliatory speeches he's given in recent weeks. But I want to just respond to one point. He said that a £7 million increase from the UK Government for next year's budget hardly represents generosity. But the reason for my making that point was to simply point out that when he and every other backbench MSP in his group talks about savage cuts, the likes of which we have never seen before, it is worth noting that there is a cash increase in the budget next year. And on top of that, if one looks at total Scottish Government spend next year, it's just over £34 billion. Compare the £34 billion to the £32 billion that the Scottish Government had at its disposal in the first full year of an SNP government, 08-09. While it would have been higher had things been better and had inflation been taken into account, it is still a £2 billion increase compared to what we had in 08-09. I've name-checked Mr Gibson, so I feel obligated to take his point.
I mean, it really is quite a ludicrous point. I mean, surely, with inflation over that period up to 5.2% a year, it's almost like saying because people were carrying their wages out in a wheelbarrow in the era of the Weimar Republic, they were actually much better off because their cash income had increased. It's real terms, surely, that matters.
I think I merely put it out there to reflect that a £2 billion increase can hardly be described as savage cuts, as he and most of his colleagues try to put out there. Let me also just want to comment in terms of what we heard in the debate. The college cuts obviously featured heavily across all parties in the chamber, apart from the SNP, who all seem to be very happy and satisfied with those particular cuts. Chick Brodie, I have to say, was particularly helpful to the opposition cause when he described that those who complain are simply bleating about cuts, and he shouted, I say this in some kind of with some kind of pseudo profundity: any country that doesn't change and manage efficiency will die. I just look forward to noting if the Cabinet Secretary listens to opposition members and increases the college budget, will Mr Brodie go along with that and welcome it at stage 3 of the budget, or will he criticise Mr Swinney for listening to those who were bleating during the course of it? But let's return to the NPD model and to capital spend, because this government has talked a good game, a very good game about capital spend for the last couple of years, but it hasn't been quite so strong when it comes to delivery. Let's reflect back in September when the budget was announced. Not only did the Cabinet Secretary fail to tell us that things had been delayed, not by months, but by years, he actually said, we are accelerating Not only is this NPD pipeline delivering, we are accelerating what this pipeline is achieving. A very, very curious interpretation of the word accelerating. And he went on to say, we're not disappointed at all with the results that we've seen so far. It's so good that others want to copy it. Apparently, we heard too. Now, reflect on the fact that in the response to the Finance Committee yesterday, the Scottish Government made the point, quite rightly, that an additional £100 million on capital spend supports approximately 1,400 jobs. So every £100 million you put into capital, that's 1,400 additional jobs supported in the economy. How does that compare to the figures we've seen on the ground? Well, in 2011-12, the Scottish Government said there would be £50 to £150 million spent through the NPD pipeline. How much was spent? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. So I asked the Cabinet Secretary, based on his £100 million figure, how many jobs did that cost the Scottish economy by the inactivity and the sloth-like performance of the government on NPD? In 12-13, they said we'd have approximately £350 million spent. Then it turns out it's not £350 million, it's £20 million. And we heard, of course, last week at the Finance Committee that it might actually not be £20 million in practice. That remains to be seen whether it actually happens. So if we get 20 instead of 350, how many jobs have been cost to the Scottish economy by that? Now, we've had every excuse under the sun for this inactivity. It was the Aberdeen Western Peripheral route, allegedly, but that turned out not to be correct from the Government's response to the Finance Committee yesterday. And we heard Kenneth Gibson saying everybody knows it takes 18 months for an NPD project to come on site. Everybody apart from the Scottish Government, it would seem, Deputy Presiding Officer, because this was announced in November 2010. The NPD pipeline was announced 26 months ago, but in that time we saw nothing in the first year. We saw £20 million in the second year, and next year we're predicted, at best, to see about half of what the Government projected. Deputy Presiding Officer, it is not good enough, and this Government has some significant movement to make over the next couple of weeks before stage 3 of the budget. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I now call on Rhoda Grant. Up to 9 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I agree with much that has been said in the debate. I do believe that the UK Government is not managing the economy correctly and austerity is not working. But neither are the policies of this SNP Government. John Swinney says that this is a budget for employability and recovery, but it does neither. Nor can they insist that their budget will create jobs and provide economic growth, but then blame the UK Government when they fail to do either. We have asked again and again for investment in housing because it creates homes, jobs and economic growth. Those are the words of the Cabinet Secretary this morning, and those are words that are worth repeating and words I agree with. In their manifesto, they promised 6,000 socially rented houses per annum. I gather by Mark MacDonald's comments earlier that that may have been the moon on a stick, but they haven't provided 6,000 new socially rented houses per annum. Indeed, they have just cut funding by £66 million in the past year. Housing benefit changes at a UK level will mean that we'll have a shortage of smaller houses that will be affordable to rent. Neil Findlay pointed out that people are facing losing their homes with those benefit changes, yet we aren't building the homes to take their place. Margaret McDougall mentioned Shelter's comments. We're heading for a cliff edge with regard to new completions in the next few years. They talked about the fall in the number of completions between 10-11 and 11-12, which is a huge number if we're going to meet the need. Margaret McDougall also spoke about the cuts in HAG, and this means that it will be more expensive. In fact, it will be almost impossible to develop houses in rural areas, and the same is very true for houses with disabled access, houses that are much more expensive to build. And she talked about a drop in HAG from 70,000 to 40,000. But I know from experience within my own constituency in the Highlands and Islands that houses in rural areas, small units without economies of scale, could have previously qualified for up to £120,000 in HAG, making them affordable to build, and that is now missing, and indeed housing associations in that area can't even put in a bid to build new houses. We also need to use housing funding for retrofits, not only just for our carbon targets, because we have those to meet, and we need not only to invest in renewable energy generation, but we also need to deal with demand if we're going to meet those targets. But we also need to look at fuel poverty, and it's only by dealing with demand do we actually tackle fuel poverty. The Government used its majority in the EET committee to commit no less than £100 million to be spent on fuel poverty. The NGOs in this area were very clear that £200 million at the very least needed to be spent, and the Government was not even willing to spend that £100 million within its own budget. Indeed, there was a cut. Yes?
Kenny Gibson.
To tackle fuel poverty, and Mr McIntosh talked about underspent savings and efficiencies. Can you tell us how much will be raised by these measures, on what it will be spent in its totality other than fuel poverty alleviation?
Rhoda Grant.
I'm sorry, I didn't pick up what the member was saying. If he wants to repeat it,
I apologise if I wasn't clear. Just that Mr McIntosh said that in terms of resources, which he was quite vague on, he said that money would be raised through underspends, savings and efficiencies. I was just asking how much would be raised through these methods, and what would it be spent on other than £100 million on fuel poverty alleviation?
No, I think Mr McIntosh was very clear as to where the efficiencies were being spent. That was on education. Housing was indeed on the budget consequential. So I think he was very clear as to where the spending was coming from in his opening statement, and I won't go back over that. We need housing as well to create jobs. Construction can lead us out of the recession, but we need to create jobs to do that. We also need to create apprenticeships for young people, but we need to make sure that when we're procuring socially rented housing, that procurement is carried out properly so that we gain the full impact of these jobs. That is why we have to invest in housing, to create jobs, to create sustainable homes and to deal with fuel poverty. Presiding Officer, we also talked about investment in education. 1 in 4 of young people are out of work, and yet we have 80,000 less college places. We need to replace the £34 million within the college budget. We need to create jobs for young people, and we need to ensure that they have the skills to fill those jobs. We asked in the EET committee of the Cabinet Secretary whether his policies were working to deal with youth unemployment, whether his funding to support youth unemployment or indeed the college cuts were working to create jobs for young people. And his answer was it's always difficult to assess the contribution of individual policies to improvements in employment. The truth is the Cabinet Secretary doesn't know if his policies are actually going to deliver one job. And I think that's a very worrying statement to be said, especially when he says this is a budget for employment. Helen Eadie mentioned EU programmes that were not being drawn down, and one of those is the Youth Action Programme. Surely that could be used for youth unemployment. 885 million available to be drawn down, only 2.5 million euros drawn down. We need to address college funding. As Mary Scanlon said, college education actually addresses inequalities, but it also gives young people the skills they need to find jobs. And what was very clear from evidence we'd received in committee previously was that those young people that were gaining jobs were actually overqualified for the jobs they were gaining, and those without skills were really being destined to a life of unemployment.
Roderick Campbell.
We haven't heard very much so far about the court estates. At the Justice Committee, we heard that there is a £57 million capital maintenance backlog in the Scottish estates. I'm not sure whether the Labour Party supports the additional money that's being put forward, the £10 million towards the capital estate budget.
Rhoda Grant.
And that's another thing that NPD should be looking at. And turning to NPD on that point, it's very interesting that the NPD budget is being cut by £333 million in 12-13, by £348 million in 13-14, but increasing by £199 million in 14-15, coinciding with another event that year, I dare say. And if that's the case, I think that is brutal, that you're playing politics with people's jobs and indeed capital investment in this country. Again, reinstating the cuts to the Egypt project would not come out of the Scottish Government's budget, but out of Network's rail asset base, and yet they refuse to do this, again failing economic growth. And other members talked about the improvement that those links and connectivity would improve the local economy. No, I've taken many interventions and I have much to cover. Can I also refer the Cabinet Secretary to Helen Eadie's contribution to the debate? And I think it was really interesting. She went through a whole range of funding packages that was available through Europe that the Scottish Government could have drawn down. And this is funding, yes, that may need matched funding, but it was funding that was already being paid out of the Scottish budget. Had they matched that funding with European funding, it would have freed up income for payment for use in other projects in Scotland. So we're losing out, and I would urge the Cabinet Secretary to take her up on her recommendation that he form a task group to look at that. Again, we looked at local government business rates, and one comment I would just want to make about business rates. I think I heard the Cabinet Secretary correctly in his opening remarks saying that he would give business rates release on empty properties that were built, but he has cut business rates relief on existing empty properties. I'm not quite sure how that squares that circle, and maybe he needs to make sense of that policy so we understand where he's coming from. Presiding Officer, we want a budget for jobs and growth and fairness, but the SNP are only cutting housing and calling for a written constitution where people have a right to a home. I believe it's a human right to have a home, and that they should put the money in the budget that provides that. Actions speak louder than words, Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. Well done. Now call on John Swinney. Mr Swinney, you have until 5 o'clock, please.
Presiding Officer, in the debate on the Finance Committee's report, which took place just before the Christmas recess, I made the point, which was largely inspired by the contribution of my colleague Jean Urquhart, about the importance of ensuring that the nature of our contributions to this debate reflect the seriousness and the substance of the issues that we wrestle with about the public finances. And I think today, again, Jean Urquhart has rather reminded Parliament of that fact. I think it might have been helpful if Jean Urquhart had spoken significantly earlier in the debate. It might have enhanced the quality of the debate that we've had this afternoon, because I don't think today has been a particularly enhanced debate by the contributions that we've had today about some of the choices that we face. Plenty of folk saying that we've got difficult choices to make, and I wrestle with these difficult choices on a constant basis. But if people are going to come forward with alternatives and different choices, they've got to be able to last for the scrutiny of an afternoon before we actually get anywhere near putting them into a budget proposal. I have to say that the quality of the debate, I think, reached a new low. And I'm sorry, I'm not normally a kind of pessimistic person, but I'm going to have to say this. The quality of the debate reached a new low when Margaret McDougall said that the importance the government attaches to the housing issue is merited by the fact that we only spent 8 lines talking about it in the response to the Finance Committee report. If we are now going to be judged by the number of words we use as to how important a particular issue is, we have reached a new level of total absurdity and banality in the debate. One of the more substantial contributions and interesting contributions to the debate came from Helen Eadie. And I want to assure Mrs Eadie at the outset of what I say that the Government takes very seriously accessing European Union funds and endeavours to maximise the accessibility we have to those funds. I won't for a moment suggest that there's not a programme or a project where there are other approaches or other ideas that could be taken forward. So I give Mrs Eadie the assurance today that the Government will look very carefully at the material that I know has been presented to the European and External Affairs Committee and consider any issues about how we might strengthen our approach to accessing European Union funds if such opportunities arise as a consequence of that scrutiny. One of the other opposition contributions which I thought was quite interesting today was that of Mr McMahon, who quoted the SCVO reflection on the debate, which it was important to marshal a long-term and holistic view of the economy. And Mr McMahon will not be surprised to hear that I do consider that the government has a long-term holistic view of the economy that has been essentially created by establishing a government economic strategy in 2007, sticking broadly to that direction of travel, and I'll come on to the principal areas of activity within that government economic strategy, but being willing to challenge that and to reflect on its contents given the changing circumstances that we've clearly faced since 2007. So that holistic view of the economy recognises, firstly, that capital investment is vital to create stronger economic infrastructure, which is of long-term and long-lasting benefit to the country. Secondly, investment in the capabilities in relation to skills and educational development within our country, which is central to the government's propositions that we put forward. Thirdly, an agenda on public sector reform to ensure our public services remain sustainable, which is what our preventative spend agenda, the integration of public services at local level and the person-centred approach in our public services is all about. And fourthly, the encouragement and the nurturing of a dynamic third sector, particularly in social enterprise activity, to become more significant players in the delivery of our public services. So that is what shapes and informs the government's agenda and why I consider the proposals that we have in front of Parliament reflects a budget that is focused on growth. Now, of course, the debate has also concentrated on some of the criticisms and arguments that have been advanced by others. Mary Scanlon made a heartfelt plea, as she often does, consistently about the issue of health maintenance. And the government has allocated an additional £60 million over 3 years in February of last year to support health maintenance. We accelerated £15 million into 12-13 from 13-14 in June, and we added a further £10 million of maintenance activity into the health service. And I simply point out to Mrs Scanlon, gently and as delicately as I can, that our ability to invest more in health maintenance would be assisted if I was not wrestling with a 26% cut in the capital budget of the government given to us by the United Kingdom government. And I don't say that to make a pejorative point. I simply say that to demonstrate how there really are difficult choices that have to be made here, and coming here and suggesting that there's some easy way to magic away these difficulties when we're wrestling with these funding cuts is not that straightforward. Which, of course, I'll give way, yes.
Mary Scanlon.
Yes, can I just say, given that I was the only person that did raise this and it came up in the Audit Committee, the Director-General for Health doesn't see this as a difficult choice. He actually says high-risk elements must be addressed as an urgent priority in order to prevent catastrophic failure, major disruption to clinical services, or deficiencies in safety liable to cause serious injury and or prosecution. That's not a difficult choice. That's a top urgent priority.
Yes, and perhaps Mrs Scanlon's government should have thought about that when they were axing the capital budget of the Scottish Government. Now, that brings me on to some of the other choices that have been advanced by the Labour Party. Ken McIntosh came here with one of those arguments, which was that we should allocate £330 million of capital consequentials that we received from the UK Government and put them all into housing. Now, the issue with that is that, of course, a whole range of projects would have to go by the wayside. The £45 million of local government expenditure, Mrs Eadie, I think, was encouraging us to give resources to local government so they could match fund capital investment by the government. Well, that wouldn't be able to happen if Mr McIntosh has his way in the £45 million going to local government gets taken away, or the money that's gone to cycling infrastructure that members are always writing to Mr Brown and I about, or trunk road maintenance that members are always asking us about, or about the investment in the further and higher education sector that I thought everybody was concerned about, or the regeneration projects in Dalmarnock, Irvine and Ardrossan. What about the Clyde Gateway? Will we just not give the money to the Clyde Gateway that everyone's always asking us to give? I'm sure Mr Kelly would be an enthusiastic supporter of withdrawing the money from the Clyde Gateway and all that it generates in that respect. And then we also then get moved on to the need to expand the resources available to the Edinburgh-Glasgow Improvement Programme. And Rhoda Grant came out with that absolutely magnificent, sophisticated financial analysis which said this doesn't come from the Scottish Government's budget. You bet it comes from the Scottish Government budget. And the reason it comes from the Scottish Government budget is we have to pay back in revenue finance all of that investment. And perhaps this is what the Labour Party was thinking when they lumbered us with £983 million worth of repayments every single year from PFI when they were splashing the cash. Splashing the cash, First Minister, and not thinking about who was going to pay for it. And I'll give way to Mr Macintosh now.
I would first of all remind Mr Swinney that borrowing against the real asset base was the SNP's election manifesto promise, not Labour's, and we're just simply asking him to deliver on his own election manifesto. Can I just also ask him, this is a question, can I ask him, has the NPD budget been cut or not? Has it not lost more than £300 million in each of 2 successive years? And could that money not be used to fund that whole list of projects that he said would not be going ahead because of our decisions?
Mr Swinney.
Well, I thank goodness Mr Macintosh is not in charge of our finances after that contribution. Because what I have done, the NPD programme has not been cut. There will be £2.5 billion of NPD expenditure. The revenue costs associated with supporting that will be delivered, along with the repayments for PFI that I inherited, along with the RAB payments that we've got to make, within a 5% threshold of our revenue budget allocated to support revenue finance projects. Who introduced that 5% cap? I introduced that 5% cap because nobody before me had even bothered to think about putting a revenue cap in to protect our long-term budget, which is what this government has set about doing. Now, in this debate, I want to make sure, and Mr Rennie captured this fairly and squarely, I want to have an open debate with colleagues about how we resolve these questions. But we have to make sure that we are dealing with the reality of the situation. There is a balanced budget in front of Parliament. If people want to make choices and alternatives, I am very happy to consider them. But as Mr Macintosh has demonstrated this afternoon, they've got to last more than a couple of hours in an afternoon. They've got to stand their way into legislation and to be passed as a robust, balanced budget, which this government has done and this government will always do.
Thank you very much. And that concludes the debate on the Budget Scotland No. 2 bill, and it's now time to move on to the next item of business, which is decision time, and to which we now come. And there is one question to be put as a result of today's business, and that question is that motion 5407, in the name of John Swinney, on stage 1 of the Budget Scotland No. 2 bill, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are not agreed. Therefore, we will move to a vote, and members should cast their votes now, please. The result of the vote on motion number 5407 in the name of John Swinney is yes 66, no 41. There were 12 abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed. And that concludes decision time. And we will now move on to members' business, and I would ask members who are leaving the chamber to do so quickly and quietly.